All right, I do believe we are live. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Break the Rules live stream. I'm your host, Lev Polyakov, coming at you today with a stream about Nietzsche and Christianity, whether we should consider Nietzsche to be the predictor of our society going in the direction that it's currently been going, as far as the general weakness that people perceive, so on and so forth, or whether Christianity is something that's actually going to bring society back to its roots, so to speak. And with us, we have the wonderful Uberboyo back again. We have Classical Theist for the first time, newcomer to the show. Thank you so much, Classical Theist, for coming in here today. And we're going to have Neil, Gnostic Informant, coming in pretty soon as well. So be sure to smash that subscribe button, smash that like button, and as well as click the bell. And we're just going to get started. Classical Theist, brief introduction. Tell all the good people about who you are and why you think Nietzsche is wrong about Christianity, why Christianity is based, why Christianity is going to lead us down the right path. And then Uberboyo is going to go for the response, and we'll just take it from there.
All right, yeah, sounds good. I guess what I would say, first of all, is I go by the name Classical Theist. I've kind of started a YouTube channel way back in 2017, just because I kind of wanted to start putting out some philosophical, metaphysical defenses of the Christian faith, specifically and primarily the Catholic faith. And I've kind of been doing that ever since, on and off. That's kind of developed mainly into my presence on Twitter, though, where I probably put out most of my content these days, Twitter and Telegram. But I mean, that's just kind of just I guess some biographical information about me. A lot of people kind of know that I'm also very supportive of Nick's whole movement as well. So that's also kind of what people usually associate me with. But to the subject matter itself, I mean, I'll concede right out of the gate that I'm not by any means like a Nietzsche scholar. I'm not an expert on Nietzsche. I haven't actually read too many of his works directly. Most of what I know of Nietzsche is from secondhand sources, like Frederick Copleston's History of Philosophy, which I think is usually pretty renowned as one of the most unbiased treatments of the history of thought, at least in the West. So I just want to kind of preface with that. So I'm definitely open to being corrected about my interpretation of Nietzsche. I understand that his own words are usually not written very systematically. They're not usually written in what most people would consider a philosophical mode of expression. So that inevitably leads to a wide variety of various interpretations of what he meant, what he was actually trying to accomplish. A lot of people kind of see his various stages in thought, his three main kind of stages of thought as not so much a some kind of desire on his part to like seek out the truth for its own sake, but kind of as a way of testing his own abilities, so to speak, through these various stages of his own thinking. So again, wide variety of interpretation of what Nietzsche actually meant. Some people don't think he was as hostile to Christianity as other people do. I kind of leave that open to various exegetical scholars. But what I would say with respect to Christianity is that I certainly wouldn't discount everything he says about Christianity, because there is definitely a sense in which I know that he, for example, believes that democracy and socialism, etc., are kind of derivatives of Christianity. And I would say that there's certainly a sense in which that's true. However, I don't think that these, we could say, political degradations are necessarily owed to Christianity in its most authentic expression. I think that primarily comes out of a secularized manifestation of certain elements that come out of Christianity, but nevertheless, I would argue are corruptions thereof. So, to, I don't know if you want me to, like, in a few minutes, just give like a pitch for Christianity contra Nietzsche,
Well,
but
I
what
think
I would,
we're gonna get to that level after Uberboyo responds. So I think you're going to be building up on what Uberboyo says and so on and so forth. And Neil's in the house as well. So welcome, Neil, Gnostic
yeah,
Informant.
what I would say though, first and foremost, if I could just preface this
Mhm.
conversation a little bit. I do think that a fundamental failure of Nietzsche, though, is his inability to really deal head on with the metaphysical foundations of Christianity. So I don't think he really, and it doesn't even seem primarily to even be his intention to refute so much the truth claims of Christianity, as if he's presenting some kind of alternative metaphysical vision of the cosmos. He doesn't really do much of that. I mean, I wouldn't say, I would certainly concede that his notion of the will to power as sort of a universal expression of uh, the cosmos can be interpreted as a metaphysic, but I don't think he's certainly not a metaphysician. In fact, he kind of looks down on the whole enterprise of metaphysics, the entire enterprise of philosophical investigation into reality. However, I think that's fundamentally his problem. I think that if you don't address those questions, then any discussion of Christianity is ultimately going to be moot. It's going to be focusing on superficial elements of it, such as its circumstantial impact on world events throughout stages of history. While I think those questions are pertinent and interesting and we can talk about them, you really do have to get at what are the truth claims that underlie the Christian vision of the cosmos. And do they have merit or do they not have merit? And that's inevitably going to lead you to ask questions about the existence of God. What is the nature of God? What is the nature of reality? What is man's place in the cosmos? And if those questions aren't addressed first and foremost, I think the rest of the discussion is kind of resting on very shaky foundation. And the conversation might be interesting, but it's not ultimately going to be significant. So I hope that we can at least get into a bit of that as well as discussing the more uh, pragmatic implications of, say, the state of Christianity in the Western world today. So I guess that's kind of how I would preface things, at least.
Thank you, Classical Theist. Steph, time to address everything the Classical Theist is talking about. It go.
Yes, all right, fantastic. Now, I'm not sure if my internet connection is that good, so if I'm constantly breaking up, please
Oh, you're going to be
pause.
better than what's going on now. I am actually streaming this through Starlink because my neighbors were chopping trees down and the tree fell right on the power line. And so my internet is down. This is outer space internet right here. So thank you,
Okay, not
Elon
too bad.
Musk. But
We're
anyway,
going
go for it.
cosmic. We're
Yes.
going, perhaps we're nearly going metaphysical if I'm to go in with the puns straight away.
Man,
Now, Neil, how you doing, man?
good.
Mr. Classical Theist, you present yourself very well. Thank you very much for the introduction, and I love the way you're approaching this, and you're being sincere about maybe the horizons of your knowledge. So I should be sincere as well. I've talked to lots of Christians before, and we constantly actually start to butt heads on the metaphysic thing. So maybe we'll actually get to that at some point. We could spend a bit of time talking about that because that's something where you'll kind of see what I mean as we go further into it. That does seem to be the place where the hammer falls. Now, I'd like to try frame the argument a couple of ways and try make it as accessible for you as possible, because if you're not like super well read in Nietzsche, I don't want to come in pretentiously and turn this into like an education on what Nietzsche actually meant. I guess it's about establishing the situation. Like we probably both align with the idea that the West is in a state of cultural decline in some sense, or a cultural crisis, we could put it this way. And even both Nietzsche's worldview and the Christian worldview is suggesting that this is a bad thing. The liberals, for example, were saying this is a fantastic thing. We're going in the right direction. Now, the thesis then comes is that, well, what is causing this? What is the driving force behind this? And I think the words that we hear an awful lot, I think this might be the easiest way to frame the argument, is the question of vitalism or moralism. So is this a situation where has Western man lost his vitality? Did he have some type of fire in his belly? And he had that for the last thousands of years. And because of comfort or a variety of different reasons, Nietzsche, for example, might even accuse Christianity of this, but we'll get into that later. Because of whatever reason, that vitality has died out and he has lost his will. He no longer has a strong will to power, and he's falling into a state of slavery. And so in order to save him, he needs to reignite that will to power, and that will actually fill him with creative energy once again and self-confidence. And it's like a pagan revival of Rome or something like this. We'll start to become all Martians again, and we'll become big and strong, and we'll build the West will go on an ascendant path. And of course, the Christian frame takes this in a much different direction, although similar in many different ways. So Christianity is saying, listen, the reason why we're falling right now is a very fucking obvious one. We've all decided to become atheists in the last 150 years, and look, everything just started to fall apart. Like, that's obvious. And because we all decided to become atheists and follow Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, we've all decided to stick our girlfriends up on OnlyFans and watch porn all the time. And it's like we've lost our morality, we've lost our alignment with the logos, I guess you could say, and we're no longer acting and adhering to a moral order. And so if we all start to allow ourselves to align with the logos, which would make us think logically, that would also make us then we have to act logically if we align ourselves and confess our soul to Christ. And then this will lead to correct behaviors, which would lead to the foundations of civilizational structures. And then all of a sudden we'd be back on the decline again, and we'd be in a new renaissance in no time. The Catholic Church wins. Yippee. Here we fucking Irish Catholic, by the way. So I'm coming in that direction. So that might be the core frame, the core argument about what's going on here, because of course these two are at each other's throats. They maybe agree on the foundational issue, but then when it comes to deciding the solution, the Nietzscheans are turning around and saying, hey, if you become a Christian, if you become a moralist, you see this on Twitter all the time, if you become some type of stiff dork moralist tradcat and all this, you're going to make us all weak and pathetic, and we won't be able to lift weights, and we'll lose our vitality, and that's not going to be the way forward, and that's a terrible idea. And so you are actually our problem that we need to overcome, and we need to go and all oil ourselves up in coconut oil and go out and lift weights in the sun. And then the Christians are obviously turning around and being like, guys, you literally identify as perverts who like, you know, talk about skinning people alive and shit like this. Like you're literally, you actually are degenerates, you know, you're crazy. The paganism thing is funny, but like Odin's a fucking meme. This is all, well, maybe that's too shallow of a rendition, but like, you know, the whole vitalism is like lifting weights is not a fucking, you know, it's not going to save the West and all this type of stuff. This is not the right perspective. Your problem is that you're not acting correctly because you've closed your heart off to the logos, to the truth. And for this reason, you're going to be lost blindly chasing after a German incel and never actually getting any progress and doing anything you need to do. And so this is where I think the heads kind of clash an awful lot. Perhaps I'll leave it there because I think that's a coherent enough point. And of course, the metaphysics one and all that stuff does come later. It's a very interesting one, but it might actually be better for that to come up naturally, or maybe we'll move on to it later when it becomes more relevant. So. Thank you very much, and I hope that lays the table quite well.
Definitely. I would definitely love to know from a classical theist whether the logos could possibly also be reached by the people who are yearning for the ideas of Nietzsche, or if that is a closed path. So, classical theist, let me know, what you think of Steph's view.
Well, I guess the way you expressed those two camps strikes me as if you yourself don't necessarily fit fully and comfortably into either one of them, because I'm wondering kind of what your before I kind of respond, where do you lie? Because it seems to me that when you were describing the so-called Nietzschean position, you had a little derisiveness in your tone for them. So clarify that for me a little bit, and then maybe I can kind of respond more effectively.
Sure. Okay. So first of all, this is something that is like war inside my soul. I'm trying to figure out exactly where I should sit. I believe Nietzsche an awful lot more. I actually think I might be very the most Nietzschean. Oh, this is going to sound absurd, but like I think I'm very Nietzschean in that I don't buy into some type of systemic perspective or something like this. He's this horrible catalyst that forces you to think from very, very hard frames of reference. And so he just puts together arguments that are so difficult for me to dismiss that I basically have to listen to him. So I'll give you an example of one that's kind of tickling me quite severely. The concept of logos. Okay. Now, the Christian thesis is that logos is obviously the logic of God that was imprinted into the world when he created it. And this spirit is what came down to earth in Jerusalem all those years ago and showed us the path towards creating the good life and creating health and all this. And this was Christ. And of course, we murdered him because we were all decrepit, ugly, wretched monsters. And we tore him apart in the cross, and we basically, fulfilled his destiny and saved us through doing this. And through this, we learned how to become logical. We learned how to become moral. We learned how to become righteous. Now, the Nietzschean challenge to this is that, and this is such a crazy way of reframing the world. I guess it kind of gets into the metaphysics, is that life is not based on strict moral principles that we like to tell ourselves, like bedtime stories. You look out into the world and you look through history, and you don't see this constant thing of the good guy winning. This is kind of simplistic, but I think you know what I mean. It's like political realism or Machiavelli or Thucydides. An awful lot of the creativity that led to the rise of the Roman Empire was not a load of good boys organizing together and following along morality and logic. Instead, it was sort of like psychopathic, crazy, schizophrenic bodybuilders who were obsessed with Martian energy, all organizing as a manor bund and saying that we're going to conquer this small part of Italy. And that energy kept on spreading out, and they eventually conquered larger parts. And then even when Rome fell, the people who conquered Rome was these groups of vitalistic, energetic, warrior German men running down from their forests, battering these Italians and telling them that, like, you're fucking short brown Italians, fuck you guys, and then like taking control of their civilization from them. And so it's not like morality that seems like it was driving their success. It seems like it was something else. And this actually really was framed for me when I came across Nietzsche's, one of his favorite guys, which is Heraclitus, who was one of the sources of our conception of logos. And he pulls it away from Christianity. In fact, he doesn't. He established this before Christianity came along. And he says that logos being the logical or the core fundamental first principle of the world, logos is the ever-changing fire. Now, this is quite philosophically abstract for people, but maybe the best way we could understand this is that that's actually very close to Nietzsche's idea of the will to power. And it's also very close to Nietzsche's idea, the modern idea of energy. And so
as far as I know, he sees the world as the perpetual state of becoming, and that is, I see what you're saying there.
So like if you want to, maybe we can get into metaphysics a little bit then. I guess Nietzsche just reconstructs a bit of a pagan worldview, and he says that we live in samsara. It's sort of close to a part of the scientific worldview, where we say we live in this giant cosmos, this universe, and it's this eternal flux of energy, and it's just whirling around in samsara. And this energy is always in conflict. This is another Heraclitus idea. It's like war is the father of all things. So the conflict between these forces is good. And the logos is the interaction and the movement of that energy and the evolution of that energy. And I guess the thesis that Nietzsche would present is that interpretation of the world, and therefore the logos, is the correct one. And if you build your worldview on this and you try to cultivate more energy and more of that, will to power, I guess you could say, in yourself, it leads to strength and health, which actually leads to the good life and success and, the Platonic ideals, I guess, in a way. And it's saying that the Christian moralism is it castrates that, that the Christian even view of logos is incorrect entirely, and it moves it in the wrong direction. So this is sort of what I'm trying to figure out at the moment, and that's my best attempt to present it in down-to-earth language.
Classical theist.
Yeah, I mean, I actually really quite enjoyed that that presentation of it. I think that I would say a few things. I think it's good that I think we're going down to the level of the very root of where these ideas, I think, originate from. I think what I would say first and foremost, though, is that the way I kind of approach this from the very beginning doesn't have really so much to do with what sets of ideas or what framework within which to see the world leads to, say, civilizational achievement. That is much more of a secondary byproduct of what I would consider are much more fundamental and important principles that have to be worked out before we can even discuss what leads to the good life, what leads to civilizational achievement. I mean, to even measure what is a civilizational achievement versus what isn't a civilizational achievement sort of requires us to do, it does require us to do metaphysics. It does require us to go back to first principles and sort of establish, okay, what is the ontological basis for the possibility of civilizational achievement or civilizational good or societal good or what have you. I think that your presentation of what logos means is pretty good. I would say, however, that there's a bit more to it than that. I think that I don't think it should be read primarily through the lens of morality. I think morality is something that is more of the human participation in an order of being that is much broader than human morality. It's much broader than even humanity itself. We would say, for example, that the human moral order is sort of our rational participation in the eternal law of God, which moves in and through everything that exists. So, for example, the teleological impulse that leads to a tree achieving its full health, achieving its well-being as a tree. That dynamic, the dynamics, the teleological dynamics that are in play there are really the same thing that are in play for human beings, just at a higher order, because we are also endowed with reason and will. So we sort of have the ability to cooperate with the divine order of the cosmos to keep human nature itself in alignment with the same pattern of divine wisdom that's imbued in everything else. So I don't think morality, human morality, is so much the impetus behind the Christian doctrine of the Logos. Human morality is more of a byproduct of metaphysical considerations that are, in a certain sense, independent of anthropomorphic or anthropocentric considerations. We have this conception in the Thomistic tradition that the world is related to God, but God is not really related to the world. God has no real relationship to the world because he's undetermined by anything other than himself. He's undetermined by anything that's finite. And so when we get into these questions of what is the Logos, we're really asking questions that are thoroughly unrelated to human morality in itself, but nevertheless do, as a byproduct, have very strong and grave implications for human morality. Whether human morality, or whether the Christian conception of the Logos vis-a-vis human morality leads to a sort of, shall we say, retreat from the kind of crucible that leads to greatness, perhaps we could say, I would sort of leave that to an extent as an open question. I mean, I think in certain cases in history, sure. I mean, the restraints that are put upon human beings by Christian morality does prevent you from engaging in certain activities that might end up leading to various heights of human achievement. I can concede that. On the other hand, Christian morality and Christian virtue can also serve as a catalyst for human achievement. I mean, if we have a vision of the world that views something like aesthetic accomplishment, human achievement, doing well for your own body, doing well for your family, these various human achievements that I think are, someone like Nietzsche would hold up as laudable, if the impetus behind seeking out these things is contextualized within a broader eschatological vision of the world, that has tremendous influence to inspire those great works and to bring about the kind of restraint of the passions that are necessary to cultivate the focus necessary to bring about those human achievements. I think without this moderating influence of a Christian perspective of what is virtuous and what is vicious, how one exercises the will to power, there's really no common consensus of where that should, what direction that should even lead one to. I mean, it seems to me without this metaphysical conception of the logos that can undergird our understanding of vice and virtue, I don't see how, like, sure, the will to power in humanity could lead to great civilizational heights like we see in ancient Greece and Rome. It could equally lead to, I would say, human activities that I think you and I would agree are quite morally degenerate. I mean, what's to say that what we see in, say, transgenderism, how can we absolutely rule that out as an expression of the will to power if the will to power is not ultimately rooted in our rational or spiritual or intellectual grasp of the real and true order of things that are imbued in the cosmos from a transcendent source. So, I mean, I guess I'm rambling a little bit, but I think that's sort of how I would at least begin to frame my disagreement.
Before Uberboyo responds, there's something I need to ask, which is, you said, Uberboyo, before that there was this very almost Dionysian type of energy that a lot of these early Christians had. And when I look at that, it does not look to me like the kind of Christians where it's like very philosophical and, you know, very thoughtful and looking towards various ideas that came before, whether we're talking about Platonism and so on and so forth. Would you guys say, and I want to get Neil on this as well, would you guys say that the early Christians, the ones that were responsible for actually creating the Catholic Church, were they bookworms, or were they these in a frenzy type of state people who, or like a regular Roman would look at and say, oh my God, these are like the SJWs of today? I don't know if that is an apt comparison or not.
Early Christians?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Could we shelve that a little bit to later, because that's a
Sure.
great conversation. But
Sure.
we'll go deep into it. I'll write it down
That,
here.
that would be a derailment. You're right, Boyo. That would be a derailment of the conversation, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah. No, like Neil would be fantastic in that, because he's got a great historical depth of the early Christians. But it's like it's a big conversation, because like it's a very interesting one. And I'd love to hear Mr. Classical
If I can add to the logos just real quick, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Because you made a good point with Heraclitus and his definition, and this word sort of becomes this like center of philosophy, center of debate for even up until right now. Like here we are discussing what even logos is, and by the time it gets to Plato seems to apply the logos to the world in a sense where you start getting people say that the mind of Zeus is the logos, and that the demiurgic power of creation is the logos. Like that is it. And so Mercury or Hermes gets called the logos because he's the messenger. He's the word of Zeus in a way. And by the time we get to Philo of Alexandria, he likes this concept, this new Plato's idea of what the logos is. And and he even writes about Mercury being the logos in his works actually. But he takes that and applies it to Judaism and says that the logos is the Son of God, who will inherit the kingdom of heaven and will judge and bring the kingdom. And so now you have this now Philo is the one who gives us the Christian logos. Basically, Christians are looking back to Philo, and when John's writing John 1, he's taking Philo's definition of this logos character, who is the embodiment of truth and wisdom and life. And so by the time we get to Nietzsche, I think Nietzsche doesn't like this idea, and because the idea that we can apply logos to the world is rather than well, he would say, and this is, I could be, we could debate this a little bit, but I think Nietzsche would say that we can't just reduce man to logical abstraction, because we have a will, and that will sometimes conflicts with rationality itself. And so Nietzsche, like myself, actually was going back to the world of the ancient Greeks and looking back before Christianity and trying to look for certain things in which he puts together this concept of the Ubermensch, where the people on top are going to drive the force of society. They're the ones that are going to make all the changes. And so, with that being said, I think he didn't like. I think his opposition to Christianity in that sense was that it is sort of a preacher of equality mentality, and he even writes about. I forgot which book it is, but I could find it if you guys really want me to. He even says, when he's talking about the Soviet, he's talking about Soviet. He's talking about communism somewhere, and he's saying that this isn't not new at all. He said this is coming from the monasteries, the church communities across the Roman Empire lived like this. This is nothing new. This is from the Christians. Communism is a Christian thing. And so, if you you guys can challenge me on that. I could demonstrate it. He said that. I could find it somewhere, but
it was anarchism. He talks about it in Twilight of the Eyes.
I'm talking about,
yeah, because the communists weren't really around, but it was like he was talking about essentially who would become the communists. He was talking about those people. There's a lot you said there, so I want to try grab all of this stuff and keep it as focused as possible, because we'll be going into all sorts of different directions. So, Neil, I get to yours after I get to Mr. Classical Theists. Blah. Loads of things I'd actually love to hear more about what you mean by these, Mr. Theist. The teleological impulse inside of a tree. So, the tree when you're describing that, are you saying that the tree has a will and it's trying to form into the apex, the uber tree, I guess, in some sense? And are you saying that the will that drives that tree into its form is the will of God? Or are you suggesting that there's we'll say a plastic force living inside this universe, which is energy, as we've described, which is in the universe, and God is outside the universe, and he actually takes that plastic force and he gives it order? And so if we took God out of the universe, we just get this like absolutely schizophrenic big blob of energy flying around like a baby playing with Play-Doh, and all the trees would turn out like spaghetti. It'd just be the stupidest place to ever live, because without God coming in with the logos in order to shape the energy into its form, it actually is it's mindless, it's soulless, it has no order of some sort. And so you have
like infinite Lizzos bouncing off each other and turning into silly putty and stretching out.
Yeah, 100%. So this is what we need God to put some discipline on this show. And so is the crafting force of God that is the most important active force in the world that we need to focus on. And Nietzsche then, or we could say even the pagan perspective, is deifying energy and saying that there's an inherent intelligence imminent within energy that leads to the tree turning into the fucking tree. And that's in energy. That's an imminent force inside of this world. And then the Christian thesis is that force is in the world, but the actual ordering force is outside of the world, and we need to align our minds with that, or we'll turn into, I don't know, the members of the cast of the Joker or something like this.
Yeah, I would mediate between everything of what you said. What I'm kind of getting at is, so within sort of our metaphysical conception of the world, we have this teleological impulse that I'm referring to. We would say comes from the act of existence. The act of existence, which would be the mode of participation in the divine existence, who is nothing but existence itself. God is the pure act of existence itself, in and through whom everything else exists by way of participation. And so the tree, for example, that teleological impulse to be what it is stems from the act of existence that it receives from God, who is able to, by way of subtraction, so to speak, limit it down to a specific mode of participation in him, which is what we would call the form of the thing. The form of the thing is that limited mode participation in the divine existence that the tree in its actual existence can thereby participate in through its activity in the world. And its activity in the world is more or less perfect to the degree that it that it conforms to that formal imprint that is given to it by God. And it's that general pattern of being, it's that general pattern of existence that permeates all things. And human being and human nature is sort of just one participation in that grand, divinely ordained cosmic pattern that I'm kind of referring to. And if I could say something about that as it relates to Christianity, and that is that I would argue that in reality, the Christian vision of the cosmos is, one could almost say, the most Ubermenschen, because its central claim is that God, who already exists from all eternity as a trinity of divine persons, and he purely out of the will to manifest and share his own inner divine glory, creates the cosmos, which is meant to be a participation in his own life, again for the purpose of manifesting and sharing the divine glory for its own sake. The cosmos ends up, because God creates the cosmos and imbues in the cosmos its own proper and authentic mode of being. The cosmos is sort of created with this dynamic capacity to act in accordance with this with this logos, we could say, through whom all things are made, or to act against it, or to act in ways that are counter to what we would say would be the true order of perfection that is imbued within creation. Creation itself has the capacity to stand athwart that. And we would say this began with the fall of the angels. The angels are the first, are sort of the first fruits of this divine impulse to manifest and share his glory outside of himself. But the angels aren't the be all and end all. God also wills for the entire created order, the entire cosmos, to also share in his inner divine perfection and his inner divine glory. And this is achieved principally through the creation of man. Man is, we would call, the minor mundi, the microcosm of all creation. He contains within himself every element of the great chain of being, right? He shares with all of the non-inanimate matter, the basic chemical compounds, basic chemical compositions that are shared with inanimate matter. He also shares with vegetative life and animal life, those elements that are proper to those grades of the hierarchy of being. And he also shares with the angel that direct participation in the life of the spirit, of intellect and will. And so man sums up the entire cosmos, right? This this
Quite
speaks
literally,
to,
too, by the way. I just want to add quite literally, too, if we're talking about the shape of the human body, where you would start out with, like, the reproductive organs being all the way in the bottom, and then going to the heart that balances everything out, and then the head, kind of like the antenna, like the bulb of the antenna that's in connection with the cosmos. So even in the way that the human body is made, you could see examples of various esoteric
yes,
designs, like the Kabbalah, for instance, or the
yes,
seven
I would say
chakras
so,
and
yeah.
so forth. Yeah, there is a connection there. But anyway, go on.
So the human being in his own essential constitution is sort of that way in which the lowest grades, the lowest, could even say the dirtiest grades of creation are able to be overcome, so to speak, and brought into alignment with glory. And that's the initial vision for the human being. Of course, but the human being has that likewise that inner impulse, the inner capacity to stand athwart that divine plan, and he did, we would say. And in this, that's obviously the story of Adam and Eve. What Christ does is he, by becoming man himself, by achieving this absolute total union between divinity and the rest of the cosmos summed up in humanity, what he does is he dives right down into the he dives right into this, to the chaos that emerges from disobeying the logos, and in diving into it, he overcomes it. He conquers the enemies of humanity, which is summed up in the world, the flesh, and the devil. And the world, the flesh, and the devil, this is actually the true source that brings humanity down to slavery, I would argue. It's the world, the flesh, and the devil that captivate our true and proper will to power, which should be sourced in the divine pattern. Because it's only in aligning our will to power with the divine order that he put in creation that we can actually tap into infinite glory. Because if the will to power is turned inwardly on oneself, then there's that has nowhere really to go ultimately. It's going to end in death, because it likewise is finite. It's not going to. It might lead to some temporal achievement, civilizational achievement, to be sure, but if it's not linked to an infinite wellspring of glory, then I don't really see a point to it. So to that extent, I would argue that Christianity, in the Christ figure, in this incarnational metaphysics, and in Christ's descent into chaos and conquering our true enemies, which culminates in his resurrection and glorified status sitting at the right hand of the Father, this enables us to transcend, I would argue, the forces that really keep us down, the forces that truly enslave us. And I understand that Nietzsche, one of his critiques of Christian morality that he calls slave morality, is that it's teaching on, say, universal charity or something. It plays into the lower rungs of society, and therefore it's going to take the Ubermensch down a level and force him to play by the rules of the inferiors, right? And by that reason, it kind of has this slave morality stigma to it. What I would say, though, is in obeying virtue and in avoiding vice, what we really do is we keep the lowest of the low within man himself at bay. And a non-Christian ethic, or an ethic that springs out of sort of a nihilistic approach to the objectivity of ethics, what that would lead to, like, that's sort of what the lowest of the low within man, quote unquote, wants to hear, I would say. because the lowest of the low within man would be our ignoble passions, our uh, our tendency to uh, just engorge ourselves with pleasure, which leads to self-destruction. These forces within us, uh, they kind of bring down the I would argue, I would say, like the Ubermenschen dynamic of the soul's triumph over the body. It brings that down to the level of the ignoble passions from, I could say, like the bottom of the barrel of humanity. And that's the real slave morality. So, I mean, I've rambled too much, I think. I apologize if my thoughts aren't very well structured or something. I'm kind of
No,
rusty
it's great.
content creation stuff.
And now Uberboyo, slave morality. What you got?
I'm gonna shelf that for maybe a little bit later, because you've brought us some very interesting things. So this is pretty base take on Christianity. This is we're talking. We can get the bodybuilders behind this. All right, I'm sure. This reminds me. You probably are talking about pivato boni, which is the idea that there's no real evil in some sense, or there's not some substance to the devil, but in fact all that really exists is God. And so the way I'm trying to imagine this in my head is, I imagine there's just this empty solar system with not very much going on, and then at the center of it you have this ever powerful sun that's exploding out all the energy, and that creates all the planets, and that creates all the heat, which creates all the life. So it's kind of a question that if you're you're living on Earth, and imagine, all right, metaphorically imagine God's the sun, and it's sort of like, if you want energy, go to the sun.
Which, by the way, a lot of church fathers, they love that analogy for the divine of the sun. A lot of the Eastern fathers. So I like that.
And that makes sense. And it's how I actually can see this in my head, what you're describing, because the sun is this central force, and it's basically like there is what is empty space? It's just darkness. There's nothing there. And then there's an interesting frame inside of this as well, which is, this is even actually scientifically studied, where energy in physiological systems, the most structured systems produce the most energy. So for example, within the context of your body, where you'll actually find this explained surprisingly well is in Bronze Age Mindset. At the start of it, he talks about this, and it's really actually really well articulated. I was astounded to find it there. But within your body, you have a variety of different systems. This comes from a guy called Ray Peat, and you have this thing called a thyroid, for example. This is something that generates your metabolism. And so the thyroid is an extremely highly structured hormone and structured system that allows you to extend energy out over long periods of time. So the high energy state within the body is structure, and the low energy state is actually formlessness. And you just lose energy the more, flabby you get. Think about even being fat, when you're lowering in metabolism and you're starting to get fat, you're losing form. But when you get skinny and shredded and juicy, obviously, you have more form. That's very interesting. That type of relationships happens. Ugly is related to formlessness. We turn into blobs when we move away from God, if we express it that way. So some purring around inside the sun that creates everything connecting together. Am I all good?
You're all good. No worries.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. So it creates all the interaction of form creates the explosion of energy that's the sun, which leaves derivatively to all the life that's around it. So that's I absolutely get that, and I think it's a very powerful way of looking at everything.
If I could say one more thing about that before you go on, but if not, by all means, just continue and I'll talk after.
No, go on, because I'll tangents are going to come up all over the fucking place. So you may as well go.
I appreciate that. I think that's a really important analogy, because it seems to me Nietzsche, his conception is that the very idea of God stands in direct opposition to proper human achievement, or to the cultivation of the Ubermensch. The very idea of God, the very idea of some transcendent source of all things, the very idea of God.
I can tell you,
but if
he says,
go ahead.
He says that because he decided that between the centuries-long debate between Epicurus and Plato, that if there's either forms, heaven and hell, or everything's atoms and void, which means this reality, that this universe that we're in right now, is it. And Nietzsche agreed with Epicurus and said, This is it. We have to find our greatness here. We're not just going to wait for some God to bring us in another realm and live in heaven, hoping that it's going to happen. Do it now. Let's get great right here, right now. And I think he's right. I mean, that's one of the big things of Nietzsche that I really agree on. I don't agree on a lot of the stuff Nietzsche says, but that I do agree on. This is it. Like we're not like you talk about in classical theist. You said, you know, yeah, without like even the lowly can get redeemed and stuff. Well, that's fine and dandy, but like, what about greatness? What about driving everything forward? What's going to be the power driving the force of society to the next level? If we're just going to sit down and just say, we're going to wait till heaven is going to be good.
In fairness, sorry, Mr. Theist, let me cut in for a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
Trying to steelman, because I actually know what Neil's talking about, and this is a really interesting critique that I'm kind of trying to build up to, because this is Nietzsche basically saying the otherworldliness as opposed to the immanence leads to this really serious problem. So I think we'll get to that. But as far as I understand what Mr. Theist is saying, Mr. Theist, I'm going to run with that.
That's fine.
You actually get power and energy from following God's structure logos, and I'm trying to describe this idea that this is actually really well presented in biological systems. For example, the thyroid structures your body to make you look beautiful. You get more energetic in life and full of life and healthy and more sexy. You become platonic by having a structured body. Whereas if you move away from God and eat the fucking burgers, you become formless. You turn into, if you turn into a tub. And that's like literal, a biological example of this metaphorical description, which should always pull your brakes. Another example is in music. When you take two harmonic sequences, so when you take an interval of a major fifth, for example, the mathematical perfection of these two wavelengths forming together creates a harmonic sound. Now, what's crazy is that these sounds are more energetic, hence they sound more beautiful. They align mathematically, so they generate more energy, hence they sound nice to us. When you take, for example, a seventh note, or a note that's very dissonant, which has a really bad mathematical fraction, it dissipates the energy. It's like washing in a lake or something like this and ruining the flow of energy. It just kind of chucks up the energy, and it sounds distorted as a consequence, and it sounds ugly. Again, another example of this precise principle manifesting here. And so I think what Mr. Theist is basically saying is that if you want greatness, if you want energy in this world, you have to understand that inside this world, in this world, is some sort of logical, principled force. Force is not the right word. Set of ideas. It's actually a very scientific way of thinking. This is why I think Christianity led to science, as Nietzsche said. That if you actually get close to this, or you obey this, it will give for you energy, which will also give for you beauty, which will also give for you, I guess you could say, good. All of these things are related together. And out of the world comes success. Out of the world comes greatness. Out of the world comes all of these things. And I think that's a very important frame, the best frame Christianity can present.
I'd like to, I love what you said, and I'd like to talk very briefly about two things related to what was said. One about the otherworldliness of Christianity and the relationship between transcendence and immanence in Christianity. With respect to like focusing purely on the otherworldly, and therefore we neglect the world as it is now. First thing I just want to kind of preface is to say, just look at what are the Christian virtues. Like, let's talk about that for a second. We have, of course, in the Catholic system, we have the three theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. And those have to do with how we receive the life of grace, the life of sanctifying grace, and that which pertain directly, primarily, and principally to our relationship with God, our quest for union with God Himself. But that doesn't exhaust the Christian virtues. It's not just faith, hope, and charity. It's also the cardinal virtues, which are what? They're fortitude, temperance, prudence, etc. You can kind of go on and on. Talk about the fruits of the Holy Spirit, the gifts of the Holy Spirit. But focus on like fortitude and temperance and prudence for a second. These, and of course there's justice as well. These pertain directly and specifically to our life on earth. And the more we cultivate the virtues of of prudence, of temperance and fortitude, the more we bring ourselves in alignment with God, the more we bring ourselves in alignment with the life of sanctifying grace in the soul. And it's the cultivation. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think that Christianity is the only worldview or religion that brings those principles, those spiritual principles into the fold?
No, I would not say that.
Okay, because I mean, we're talking back in the ancient world. Empedocles said that justice should be deified and worshipped. And
no, I mean, I like these are by no means unique to Christian revelation, but they're contextualized within a system that is unique. So, it's in the practicing of these virtues, which stem from faith, hope, and charity in the soul, which enable us to contextualize all these virtues to be elevated to a state of existence that goes beyond our nature, which doesn't just enable us to live in alignment with God, but enables us to participate in the very inner life of the Trinity itself. And to the extent that we not only follow these virtues, but also live the life of grace itself, that is how we attain union with God. And the thing about Christianity is that it does place of primary importance the eschaton, right? The end of all things, eschatological truths about the world to come. That is true, but ironically, I would argue that in placing our ultimate summum bonum in an eschatological turn of events that we don't really have any direct control over, it kind of forces us not to bring the shall we say, like, egalitarian vision for humanity. It forces us not to bring that down to the level of life on earth. And so it's actually the supernatural dimension of Christianity that sort of forces us to focus not so much on ensuring absolute total equality on earth, but in ordering and structuring society in such a way that that the inequalities that Christianity acknowledges exist within society, but ordering them in such a way that can maximize virtue and diminish vice according to the proper ordering of each member of society. So it embraces the inequality of humanity, actually, because it's able to contextualize inequality within a principle of equality that is supernaturally grounded. So, for example, a Christian view of things wouldn't necessitate that the poor be that service to the poor come at the expense of great societal achievements of the aristocracy. Pope Leo XIII, in his encyclical Rerum Novarum, talks about how when this notion of the universal logos is properly applied to human society, it will bring out the best in each class, and it will not lead to class warfare because, for one, Christianity would say that the highest member of society, or rather, I should say, while it is true that like the highest members of society and the aristocracy are supposed to, they're supposed to be generous with what they have and with what they've achieved, and because that leads to their own self-fulfillment and their own perfection. Nevertheless, the poor are also admonished likewise not to resent the rich, not to resent the aristocracy, because they can suffer from the very same vice that the avaricious man suffers from. The poor can be more avaricious than the richest man in the world. And this is what Christ talks about being poor in spirit. Being poor in spirit means that we have a healthy detachment from material things. But the poor and the lowest rungs of society, they can be just as guilty of avarice as the very poor and the very rich. And so the vision of Christianity is to contextualize these inequalities that exist, to respect them, to actually embrace them, but to contextualize them within this broader vision of the common good, so that each member of society in fully participating in society to the extent that he can, to the extent that he's fully, or to the extent that he's properly fulfilling his sort of given role, and that role is given either by nature or given by society itself. That in itself brings about this greater transcendent spiritual principle of equality. So this spiritual notion of equality can be accomplished in and through the inequalities of human society. So I would say that Christianity has actually a built-in mechanism to resist these negative externalities of say, mass democracy or socialism or communism. While I do recognize that those, what those do is I think they take that spiritual equality that we can kind of strive for, which is really just universal charity, universal love of all, willing to all what is their true good. It takes that, but it secularizes it, and in secularizing it, it leads to those systems. But it need not be secularized, and that's the point. And when it's not secularized, I would say it's actually its biggest Christianity is the biggest enemy to those systems of thought.
The gears are turning in Uberboy's head. I also don't want to forget to also mention Christianity being a kind of control system when it isn't secularizing those things, but we'll get to that as well. But Uberboyo, go for it.
Well, I think so. This is good because we've been digging this down, and I don't want to go into this and straw man and talk silly, like, Christianity's slave and all this type of stuff, and Nietzsche's an incel and all this. What I actually see now is a very firm challenge from what I understand is the Nietzschean perspective. Now, this might be best framed as Nietzsche's idea that because Nietzsche does not want resentment. He does not want you to sit down and be bitter and stomp your feet all the time and blame Christianity for tying your shoelaces together or whatever it is. He wants you to embrace, affirm, and then move forward. Like, he's very, I guess you could say, progressive in his attitude. And what you're describing with the Christian perspective, which is very mature, it's a very, it's obviously true, it's obviously right, that there's some type of mysterious logos pregnant within the world, and fuck knows how it got there, like it looks like some form of intelligent design, and every scientist and every artist is interacting with that, and we in the West call that God, the Muslims call that Allah, and scientists and artists sometimes even come up with private relationships with it, but it doesn't matter because it's there. And Christianity claims monopoly in that, and of course they're entitled to, because every religion does, and just because every religion does is not an invalidation of Christianity at all. That's not how that works. But nonetheless, there's an interesting question implicit inside of that, where as Western man was disciplined to focus on that logos and ask that really mystical question. We all got together in our monasteries, and we stopped running around like barbarians swinging our axes, and we got together in monasteries and we sat down and we focused on the logos, and we tried to penetrate into reality. This is Nietzsche's such an astounding way that Nietzsche thought, because he saw this happening, that we began to evolve as Western people. We all sat down and we're penetrating, and we're trying to understand rocks and writing and mathematics and stones and trees. We're looking for these teleological impulses, and we're trying to understand how this Platonic order imprinted within the world produces this state of grace when you align with it. How does the musician go into that state of grace when they're playing the beautiful song? They're playing through these mathematical principles, but they're creating something that's ordered, energetic, and beautiful. This is amazing. And they do this for a long enough period of time that Nietzsche says that we ask questions about that logo so much that we begin to actually start to ask really fucking serious questions about it, such as, wait a second, is that logos actually anchored in some supernatural world? Now, why do I say this? Because I think this is where the rubber hits the road. Neil brought it up earlier. And I think what happens in the 17, 18, and 19th century is we start to realize that the logos is some type of set of principles not rules, but set of principles that exist within the world. Just like a musician understands that there's laws of harmony. Now, the way you interact with the laws of harmony is that the laws of harmony is somewhat neutral to you. There is no morality really with the laws of harmony, but instead you as a musician have to obey them. And if you obey them correctly, you produce beauty, because this is the Christian thesis of how you produce beauty. And then if you play the piano, but you can do it with your own style, and you can bend the rules and all this, and you can actually express yourself in relationship to the rules, but you cannot violate the rules because you'll make something ugly. You have to align with the principles, but then also there's this sort of like give and take. And this evolves very quickly into the Western attitude towards science. We start to look at the world as having logical principles inside of it, a logos. And we start to wonder ourselves as these tactile master manipulators of this world. We start to play with these rules a bit. We become creators. We become manifestors. And this starts to become a very big problem, because this scientific attitude produces a very, very profound and penetrative understanding of the world that effectively starts to make us say this logos, the whole idea that this logos is anchored, the way I relate to this logos is through some type of other vessel, which we would call Christ, which we would call some supernatural force, is not the direct way that I go to it. Maybe I'm not articulating myself properly, but if I'm a scientist, my understanding is it's me going out directly to the logos of the world and communicating with it. And I don't need God. I don't need prayers. I don't need a fucking priest. I don't need a church. I don't need any of that stuff. I can go out and I can penetrate into the Platonic logos and find it and create something amazing as a consequence. And me having to go through this whole loop of conceptual thought to a supernatural world because Christ brought it down and he's the only way towards this truth seems like an incorrect deviation, a creation of another world that doesn't make sense at all. It seems like it's just wholly unnecessary in order to achieve the state of grace with which what science can do directly. And so I basically guess the thesis is that you can reach the divine in a sort of secular way. No, and you don't need the supernatural deviant point through Christianity and all these things as a consequence. And we were sort of educated by Christianity to think that way. And weirdly, then we subverted it in and of itself. Now, I've said a hell of a lot of stuff there. I'm not sure if you're even following, but please, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I actually. So what I would argue, though, is that that seems to maybe, to an extent, oversimplify the progression of Western thought vis-a-vis the role of empirical science as sort of an outgrowth of that impulse to deepen our engagement with the logos as imprinted in created things. But I would argue is actually that in a certain way, the turning away from the more, I guess we could say, philosophical or metaphysical dimensions of intellectual inquiry to the purely physical laws of nature and our ability to manipulate those for some technological achievement or whatever, that is in itself not so much a progression but a degradation. It's turning it, because I would say that the logos are, maybe we could say the I mean, we could still use this word, but like the vestiges of the logos that are imprinted in created things, it exists through a hierarchy of order. There's the metaphysical principles that underlie or that undergird created things, such as act and potency and form and matter, and the role of the act of existence, and even goodness itself, goodness and perfection. These, I would say, are they are still today rationally accessible truths about the metaphysical constitution of reality, and that so you can those principles, though, I would say, are at a higher level than the circumstantial ways in which natural things, physical substances tend to behave, or how they tend to be physically constituted, either chemically or subatomically or biologically, what have you. These are, I would argue, are the sort of the lower rungs of the ladder of human intellectual inquiry. Now, they do, of course, they show results in ways that are, I guess you could say, more like unquestionable than, say, the debates having to do with, I don't know, like hylomorphic dualism or Cartesian dualism, these more metaphysical debates. Clearly, we can see that the stove works. We can see that the rocket actually can reach the moon, etc. But I mean, part of that is because we have, as embodied beings, we have a greater proximity to these lower rungs of intellectual inquiry. We can have a more direct engagement with physical substances as they act towards us, right? It takes, you have to enter through stages of negation and removal in order to reach these higher levels of more metaphysical and philosophical inquiry. So what I would say is that I don't think that this progression from like metaphysics to science constitutes some kind of proof that we've shaved off the need for locating the logos in a transcendent source of all things. It's more having to do with just the historical progression of our shift of focus in our intellectual inquiry. The more we focus on physical substances and how they react and what they're made out of course, we're going to lead to all kinds of technological advancements that come from that field of inquiry. But just because we've shifted our focus to that field of inquiry doesn't mean that we have thereby refuted or undermined the necessity to ultimately root those vestiges of the logos in the transcendent source of all things. That's a question that is adjudicated through metaphysics. That's a question that's adjudicated through, the classical arguments for God's existence, like St. Thomas's argument for God's existence, from the distinction between essence and existence. Those are questions that aren't going to be adjudicated by a shift of focus to these more empirical questions. We can shift our focus to that, sure, and we can produce wonderful technological advancements, but that's not going to leave, that will still leave those other questions unanswered unless they're adjudicated within that realm of intellectual inquiry, which is something I don't think Nietzsche really does. I don't think he really, because Nietzsche doesn't really give a like philosophical refutation of St. Thomas's argument from contingency. Maybe he does. I've not read it, but you kind of see what I'm saying.
Yeah, 100%. So I actually really like what you're saying. I think it's really well put together, and I think you're very heavily leaning on the concept of grace, which I don't think is a bad thing at all. So I'm going to try to explain it in my own words. It's like a metaphysical principle tends to be an awful lot more abstract, I guess you could say, and then a mechanical principle is Newtonian's law of thermodynamics. And you're accusing and saying, here, don't worship fucking Newton's law of gravity and think that you've found God, when God's principles might be far more profound than that. So, for example, Newton will tell you that an apple falls off a tree, but maybe a higher metaphysical principle is the principle of symmetry or something like this. And these are much more sophisticated principles. And the way
to just modify that a little bit, like Newton will tell you how the apple falls off the tree. Metaphysics will tell you what is motion, what is change.
So then another analogy I use in my head is with going back to that music analogy. There's a logos imprinted in music. Now, what's interesting is that at different stages of your musical career, you actually relate to the musical experience in different ways. You begin by trying to follow the patterns and the numbers, and it's very mechanical. Your interaction with the law, and you could even look at music and look at it in this very autistic, spurgy, I've got to get all the harmonics together, but that actually doesn't produce good music. It can produce sort of nice music that's technically clean, but it doesn't produce actual, you could call it graceful music. Whereas if you listen to a true talented composer, they're hitting all of the mechanical laws of harmony, but they're also doing it with abstract, you could call them metaphysical things, feel, emotion, passion, some other intangibles that are really,
mystical intuition.
intuition. They're following some type of symmetrical field to it as well. They got rhythm. They've got all these other things that
The
people
Orphics,
don't.
the Orphics were big into this kind of thing.
100%. And so this allows them to get a more sophisticated interaction. So I guess your accusation is that if the Nietzscheans, like we're going to sit around and we're going to start smashing our hammer off the table and being like, we found the scientific principles, get the fucking rid of the churches, we're done, burn the monasteries, it's over, we figured out we don't need them anymore. You're sort of like, listen, dudes, you're literally actually have started to just focus at the start once again. And
from what I understand, Nietzsche is also an anti-realist when it comes to science. I mean, like from what I understand, he doesn't even see scientific paradigms as really getting to the root of reality in the first place. So I mean, there's that disjointed element to his thinking as well. At least it seems to me. Again, not a Nietzsche scholar, so you can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
And it's not necessarily like I'm representing him perfectly either. So this is me in some sense using him as a guide to try help me interpret what's going on. But that's an interesting frame. Like, it's a really powerful frame. I really, really like that. It's a strong frame. It's a strong approach and a strong. Now, I think this is where another challenge comes in that is starting to, again, go to one of his very serious accusations where you tend to have this frame of it's a slight cynicism and pessimism towards all progressive modernizing impulses within Western man. Now, I know that we're in a state of we're in a terrible botched situation at the moment, and we're through this, going through this artistic crisis and all this. But I don't think that that's necessarily been the entire story of modernity. I think we've achieved an awful lot of aesthetic beauty and success in many different ways. And I'd even say things like metaphysical grace have shown up in very secular ways through much of our works, like the artistic period of modernism and all this. And there's a lot of things we can get into. Like, even film could be described as an extremely high art. And a great achievement. Now, of course,
for sure.
My criteria for judging all this is sort of a civilizational achievement perspective. And I've noticed that this is something that a judgment criteria that you don't want to have. Now, this is where it gets into this. It's almost like the cart before the horse, morality before the result. And Nietzsche, I guess, is pushing us to sort of say, well, listen, the Christians are turning around and telling us, you have to go back to the metaphysical principles. You have to anchor your thinking in this. You have to start from there. And this leads to this constant shooting your own foot, it feels. It stops us being able to engage with modernity and just kind of go chase after it and embrace it and go and explore these principles and go into interact with this logos and go and build something. This is his accusation of nihilism, as we'd understand it. And I've noticed this a little bit, like you're pessimistic towards civilizational achievement, and I would see that as a pretty good judgment criteria. I don't think many people would even be asking these questions as much as they are nowadays if civilization was not achieving things right now. And so, what is the situation there? And I'd love then to go into Dionysus and all this type of stuff, because Neil has loads of stuff he'd like to share.
Christians as SJWs.
We'll maybe get into that, but I guess we're sort of going there at this point. Like, there is
unfortunately, I only have like 20 minutes left myself, but I'd like to pick this up sometime soon because I've been really thoroughly enjoying this conversation.
Definitely.
But I would like to touch on some of the things you just said. I think it's actually very important. I'll concede that what I've said does sort of manifest a certain degree of pessimism toward civilizational achievement. However, I mean, you read a text like Gaudium et Spes of the Second Vatican Council, read what the popes have taught over the past 50, 60 years, and I think what you'll see is yes, sort of a pessimism toward how much civilizational achievement can really do for the human person. However, it's not a repudiation of it. In fact, Vatican II says, in modernity, that there are rays of light, rays of sanctification that are still present even in the most post-Christian of societies, and indeed pre-Christian societies. I mean, yes, while I believe that returning to metaphysical principles and such is important, it's what's actually the most important is the life of grace itself. Living in union with God Himself. Cultivating the virtues and avoiding vice, living in Christ. And I think that how we can sort of get at the intellectual foundations of why that should be our framework, that will require us to do a lot of metaphysics and thinking and philosophy. However, just look at how Christianity approached came to approach, because I understand there was an initial, much stronger initial skepticism in the early church, but it gradually came to be an attitude of, okay, let's look at this sort of fallen Roman Empire and sort of see what in it can be sanctified, what in it can be baptized, what in it can be integrated within this richer, at least in my judgment, richer vision of the cosmos. And so you can see, even in our liturgies, even in the development of the Roman liturgy, what we have is what did the Roman liturgy, what most characterizes the Roman liturgy? What came to characterize the Roman liturgy? Well, the use of Latin, for one, like the integration of the Latin language, the Gregorian chant, the chants of our liturgies, a lot of architectural elements that have gone into the building of these churches, these beautiful cathedrals. That was a result of the church sort of looking at what is true, what is good, what is noble, what is
I gotta
holy.
step in here real quick, classical theist, because I know you don't have a lot of time left. So regarding the Latin situation, while Latin is a very beautiful language and Latin mass is incredible, when it comes to how knowledge was transmitted to people, one of the issues that I've always had with this idea of the great chain of being is that in a way you are applying a control system over the populace when they don't really know what exactly is being said. If I understand it correctly, they go to church, they hear the priest say what they say, and then they go home. After obviously the printing press, we've had we've had the schism within the church the second time around, and we have had people who you could say took things into their own hands for better or worse, and a lot of times it was worse when it came to things like socialism and so on and so forth. But the idea that you would have a church that would impose this order upon everybody and say, okay, this is the right way of doing things, I still can't help but think that that also resulted in a lot of abuse that people were able to level at their underlings, at the people who were not as well connected as the people who were on top because of that control system.
I almost wonder if the hierarchical structure of the church is probably something that like a true Nietzschean would probably admire to some extent, maybe.
Here, what?
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, I can address that later.
Do you mind if I take that?
Go for
a little bit as well.
Go for it.
Man, like you're describing a flaw in human nature, less so than like I would see this, and I'm not trying to be rude, but the church is I look at it like a body, the church is trying to create this system.
St. Paul does too.
There you go, the body politic. We're trying to create this system. We're trying to create this structure that is going to try to bring a large amount of people who are busy working on farms, like a load of drunk Irish people, and they're trying to bring them towards the fucking crazy shit that we're talking about here, the logos. They're trying to bring them towards more order in their life. Nietzsche himself even says this. The credit must be given to Christianity and for Buddhism for being able to bring a people who would have been having their nose in the floor to begin looking at something beyond themselves. And these type of structures are necessarily going to be put into place in order to help take people. Now, people are always going to have to be led in some way. Like, look now, we freed everybody from Christianity and everybody just follows the fucking news as if it's the new church. There's no difference whatsoever. Like, it just does not work this way. I'm sure within the synagogues, there's the same groupthink as well that's annoying as fuck in many different ways. Take it outside of religion altogether and you have secular political parties. Like people think in groups. Like we are group thinkers in some sense. And I think Catholicism certainly would have some type of hierarchical structure because it wants to try to establish an order over what people think to create a sort of structured way of working and all this. And it's, I don't know, I'd like the free thinking and all this type of stuff, but at the same time, you have to, there's other questions you need to ask because your ultimate goal is to try get towards the grace thing. And do you think Michelangelo really gave a fuck that he had, would Michelangelo have created the beautiful statues of David if he was sitting around like an autistic Nietzsche and questioning was the church really the truth and all this type of stuff? Probably not. He would have missed out on his lifetime of interacting with God actually by creating beautiful statues, secular or not, if he did this. So I think I understand where you're coming from, but I think the Catholic Church gets an awful lot of hassle for this, where it's like it's more of it's a part of reality. Everything has this in some way.
Neil, what do you think about it?
So I wanted to pull this up, and this is I think, in my opinion, and the Antichrist by Nietzsche. This is the hardest hitting bars, if you want to call it that, for just to be funny. He says the Christian concept of a God, the God, the patron of the sick, the God as a spinner of cobwebs, the God as the spirit, is the one of the most corrupt concepts that has ever been set up in the world. It probably touches lower watermark in the ebbing evolution of the God type. God degenerated into the contradiction of life instead of being its transfiguration and eternal yeah. In him, war is declared on life, on nature, on the will to live. God becomes the formula for every slander upon the here and now and every lie about the beyond. In him, nothingness is deified, and their will to nothingness is made holy. Whoo! What do you? I mean, there's a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, I just totally.
It sums up everything we were talking about. It really does in that one, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it does kind of cover probably the crux of the Nietzschean critique for sure. I just totally repudiate it. I mean, I think that if anything, when you have a proper understanding of what we really mean by God, it just comes off as so much nonsense.
Well, Mr. Theist,
yeah, go ahead.
again, apologies to interrupt, but I again would like to kind of frame this a little bit with my understanding of why he might be accusing this way. Now, again, this is a very big challenge, so
Sure.
I'll lay it out there, and you can think of it what you wish. But you said earlier, for example, that the Christians at the beginning in the early church didn't have quite as, I don't want to call it aesthetic, but they didn't have, as we'll say, an appreciation for Rome as much as they did later on. Later on, they started to reintegrate that stuff into it as they.
I mean, naturally, because of the persecutions. Yeah.
So okay, so that would be one side of it. But I guess the frame with Nietzsche is that Christianity obviously comes from Judea. Judea has just essentially been nuked off the map. But
it's also, in my opinion, is the marriage between Platonism and Judaism. But yeah,
and so this is what I was going to get into, is that what basically happens is Christianity. This is Nietzsche's suggestion. This is the narrative, I should say. I'm not trying to blame Nietzsche for my thoughts here. Christianity comes in as a religion of a literal group of slaves. It spreads among, and this is a historical thing that I'd love to get Neil's fact checking on. It spreads among largely the immigrants, largely the people who are in Rome who've been enslaved from the Mediterranean basin. And it is essentially in some sense, a communist movement. It is rebelling against the patriarchal structures of Rome, which has in some sense the form that Christianity has now, the high, profound form of hierarchy that it has now. Now, Christianity, you could say, overthrows Rome while Rome was falling apart. I don't believe that Christianity was the cause of it, but it was certainly a part of the end. And then later on, the Romans, and you could say the ancestors of these people, bring back in Platonism, which actually might be some of the more sophisticated parts of this religion that we actually appreciate so much. And in some sense, this is a European tradition morphing, and our instincts morphing Christianity into something that is, Platonic, I guess you could say, is something that's suitable to our taste, if you will, and bending it to suit ourselves and turning Christianity into like an Aristotelian religion, which is how we're talking about it now. But at the beginning, Nietzsche would accuse it of being it's just complete. It's almost like an incoherent religion. You listen to it talk, like the Romans called it atheism when they first came across it. They are presented with it, and they're sort of like, this is just a load of angry. It's the same way as we would look at the woke movement now. These people are just making up shit that just really doesn't really have any tangibility. And all the things that we appreciate and the order we get out of it now came actually from Hellenic Greece, that we just had to bend and turn Christianity into Platonism to people, as Nietzsche said. And then that would probably bring us into like the Dionysian early Christians and all that. Now, I've said a lot. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, let me just throw in a little bit.
Go on, Neil. Go on, yeah.
Christianity doesn't get Platonized by the post-Constantine church. Christianity is Platonized immediately, right away. The earliest Christians that we know about, the Carpo-Cracians, I'll give you an example. There's a group called the Carpo-Cracians that were living in Egypt, in the Alexandria, Egypt. We know about them from Harpocrates, his son, his name is Epiphanius, and he was deified, by the way. Deified, a Christian? Yeah, this is how wide-ranging views Christians were. But they had, not only were they worshiping Jesus, they had statues of Plato and Pythagoras. And they thought that Jesus, Plato, and Pythagoras are three people who attained the highest gnosis and were deified in apotheosis. Those are Christians early on. Late 1st, early 2nd century, we're talking about. And so the reason why I wanted to bring in is Philo is a Jew living in Alexandria before Christianity is even a thought in anyone's mind, and he's already bringing in the Platonic. He's even saying that Plato's just like another version, just another Moses, basically. And this was sort of what was happening in the first century. Middle Platonism was marrying Judaism, and Christianity comes out of that marriage as its offspring. That's basically how Christianity comes along. Now, Orthodoxy is basically like looking around and saying, all right, some of this stuff is a little wild, and let's stick to Paul. Let's stick to what Paul had in mind. That's kind of it's sort of a saying that Platonism is too much leaven for the dough, basically. It's that type of thing. So you have a step back from Platonism when the church comes around, if anything.
Oh, interesting. So I have it the wrong way around, Mr. Theist.
No, but I get your point though. Because the church is definitely trying to chop off a lot of extra fat, basically, and keep it simple, keep it so it's easy to control, if that makes sense.
Well, that's the control element that I'm kind of talking about here, which is important. Yeah.
I'd like to pick your brain on that. Maybe Mr. Theist has got limited time, so I'd love to hear what he has to say, and then maybe I'll pick your brain on that when we go.
Yes, Mr. Theist, how much time do you have left? I want to make sure I respect the limit here.
Yeah, I got about 5 minutes, but like I said, I'd like to pick this up some other time. I think it's a very good conversation. What I would say is that I think, and I understand that varying historical interpretations will clash in terms of, getting into the historicity of the Gospels or discerning, the extent to which Paul is a reliable conveyor of the primordial Christian revelation. I get that, and I understand, like, we're not going to adjudicate those questions from a historical point of view right now and right here. What I would say is that I would just make the claim that because I do believe, I just want to kind of preface by saying that I think that, yes, the more metaphysical and the more philosophical, the more you pursue those considerations, those metaphysical and philosophical considerations about the divine, the more you will come to understand the radical coherence that obtains between that conception of divinity and its incarnational implications. And so I kind of root the essential plausibility of Christianity in that coherence, that I think the more you study the existence and nature and attributes of God from a metaphysical and philosophical angle, the more you will see the rational plausibility of that reality becoming one with humanity in the incarnation, and then digging into history and seeing where that may have been manifested. Now, again, that's the actual historical arguments that underlie that would have to be tabled for another time. But what I would say is that if you kind of are already thinking along those lines, and then you, as a matter of faith, as a leap of faith, you accept the reliability of the Gospels and the general and the essential reliability of the Church to adjudicate for us what is the authentic interpretation of divine revelation, then I think once you accept that, and then you, or at least you accept that as one possible hypothesis, and then you go back and read the Gospels as they are presented to us through the Church, and you read the Apostolic Fathers, and you read the ante and post-Nicene Church Fathers, you begin to see, first and foremost, through the reading of the Scriptures themselves, again, as presented to us through the Church, so the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the Pauline epistles, the Catholic letters, Revelation, and then the Apostolic Fathers and the ante and post-Nicene Fathers, I would argue you do see a profound degree of intrinsic coherence between those elements of Greek philosophy that the Church has salvaged and biblical revelation. And again, I understand that can take us into a whole debate about historical, exegetical interpretation of various biblical passages. But again, just from the standpoint of someone who accepts the church as an outgrowth of this rational plausibility in the incarnational God, I see it as very plausible and persuasive. So that I do not actually see the Christ of the Gospels as playing into the hands, so to speak, of some like anti-intellectual Roman precursor to the woke mob, or whatever you want to say. I think the more you read and digest the teachings of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus that he proclaims with respect to his own ontological identity with the divinity, the more you ponder that, the more you accept that and integrate it within your interior and spiritual life, you will actually find in that a message that is totally antithetical to that way of thinking. I mean, Christ, when he says, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's," that in itself, mystically meditated upon, opens up a whole way of opposing the kind of like, I guess you could say, communistic, anti-aristocratic agitation that you might say channels the true spirit of Christianity. I would say that the more you meditate on the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, the more you see that's not the case.
But it
And we
also
don't have
opens up
time
an
to,
aristocratic agitation on the other side, though. Like when people were saying that there's a similarity between Christianity and Nietzscheanism as far as the authoritarianism goes, I tend to agree. I think that there is some kind of a horseshoe theory, you could say, based. Yes, that's right, Uberboyo. I'm calling it out. Because both sides, they are not big fans of liberalism in general. So on one hand, you would have people that would be all SJW about poor people, and on the other hand, you would have people who would want this very strict hierarchy. Neither of those I personally see as being the way to go. And I don't know, it's very difficult to navigate these waters, but I definitely appreciate.
again, I mean,
yeah.
I would just say like the Catholic theological tradition with respect to that very question on how we should approach, let's say, human inequality, and how we should approach civilizational achievement in light of human inequality, how we should approach the tension between those two things. I think the Catholic intellectual and theological tradition synthesizes this very well. I mean, I think that the more we tap into that, the more we'll come to realize that actually Christ, in his transcendence of the world, enables us to approach human inequality through a spiritualized lens that can thereby allow for the aristocracy to thrive, for civilizational achievement to thrive, while also making sure that that doesn't turn us into to like some kind of like a totalitarian state that would totally trample the rights of the poor. Again, I would just say Rerum Novarum is, I think, a very good treatment of that, and I don't have time to really give a grand conclusion to like my thoughts on this discussion. So
we got to do a second one for sure. Classical Theist, I really appreciate you coming in.
I think we should.
And we're going to do it on Patreon. Patreon.com/breaktherules. I consulted nobody about this. This is spur of the moment because I want to get more people on Patreon. So become a patron today, patreon.com/breaktherules. And we are going to do another Patreon exclusive where we are going to get down in the nitty gritty of liberalism versus both Catholicism on one hand and Nietzscheanism, the Ubermensch, on the other hand. Yes.
So, Lev, you telling me there's this horseshoe that I can get that takes the most evil parts of Nietzscheanism and Christianity and merges them together to make this sort of like Uber world perspective, and we're gonna sell some Patreon. What's going on? That's
right. We got to ride the horse on the rough road that is our existence, which is why we need to equip ourselves with the horseshoes. But anyway.
Okay. Good stuff. All right.
All right, I think this is the end of the
Um,
stream pretty much, unless, I don't know, Neil, Uberboyo, do you guys want to stick around a bit? Because I know Classical has to go right now.
Doesn't matter to me.
I'd love to pick Neil's brain. I'd actually like to ask him a couple
All
of
right,
things. Yeah. But
excellent.
Mr. Theist,
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Mr. Theist, thank you very much for your time. And like, it was actually like, it's a pleasure talking. It's really good to someone who's just polite, like well informed, well read. It's fantastic. So thank you very much.
Yeah, then likewise. I really enjoyed your thoughts. I actually just turned out more interesting than I thought it was going to be. So,
Okay,
yeah,
that's good.
I'll enjoy following through with this in the future. Thanks for having me on, and
Thank
I
you
also
so much.
enjoyed your thoughts, Neil, as well.
Yeah, nice meeting you, definitely.
Thank you. And where
All
can
right.
people find you before you go?
Yeah. So on Twitter, I'm at classical theist. Theist was taken, so it's like a classical theist without the T at the end. It's kind of embarrassing, but whatever. So that's where you can find me on Twitter. I'm also on Telegram at classical theist. On YouTube, also classical theist, and also I stream on cozy.tv. So that's cozy.tv/classical theist. Big supporter of that platform and the community with it. So thanks again.
Thank you. And that T, by the way, that's not a T, it's the cross, which you are yearning towards, as are other Christians, to get closer to. So there we go. That's how the Twitter thing works.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. God bless you all. Thank you.
God bless you.
God
All
bless,
right, guys,
bro.
so we're going to keep going here with Neil, Gnostic Informant, and the great and powerful Uberboyo. Let me just adjust the camera over here so that it actually looks presentable. And once again, everybody, if you are enjoying this, be sure to smash that subscribe button right now. Smash the like button. It's all very, very important to get all the people in here, break the rules, bringing all the people together all the time. So anyway, Uberboyo, where would you like to take this conversation with the great Gnostic Informant?
I think the acid's finally kicking in, man, because there's like two Levs in front of me right now. So no, maybe that's a stare into early Christianity. Well, look, Neil's like very like well informed and all this. Actually, Lev, I'd love to hear your thoughts on all that, and then I'd love to pick Neil's brains. Like, what's your kind of frame? Because you're obviously always worried about the totalitarianism, which I get.
Of course,
that's definitely not a nice thing to happen. But you're listening to all that. Like, what do you see going on? Because I guess in some sense you've found yourself hosting these conversations quite a lot. Between degenerate Nietzscheans, I guess, and the pagans and Styx, the Styx doing his magic rituals and all this. And what do you see going on? Like, do you actually do you see us all just trying to say what's the best way we can instantiate a hard right totalitarian government? Should we do it Nietzsche style or Christianity style? Or
yes,
do you think there's...
yes, absolutely. No, I think that all the things you guys are talking about is very important because these are things that liberals don't bring up at all. These are things that completely get ignored, so the people who are going to pick them up, they're usually going to be people who see a substantial problem with liberalism in general. So what I try to do is see if I could find some kind of a balance between making sure that we don't end up in like a shitty theocracy where it's way worse than anybody could ever imagine, or like a shitty, top-down rule by the Ubermensch where everybody who says anything critical of the Ubermensch ends up getting squashed, where it's not so much a system of everybody recognizing that the Ubermensch is all-powerful and thus all-knowing, like a philosopher king. It's more of a system of a would-be Ubermensch putting on the clothing that would look like a philosopher king, and that everybody is going to tell the Ubermensch is like the philosopher king because they don't want to get killed by this person who wields so much power now. That's the primary concern there.
Bodybuilder.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, fair enough. And so I guess like you're looking at it and I guess you'd have like a very liberal perspective. I think Neil does as well, actually. And you see that like you're a great believer in the freedom, and you think that, of course, the religious system that we put together in Christianity may have served its purpose in history, but you think that we've evolved sort of past that, and we want to embrace the liberal. There's an awful lot of good in liberalism that we want to actually like try preserve. But obviously, it might have gone a little bit too far recently, and we want to try temper it as well. And so it's trying to find a middle between all this crazy stuff that's going on.
Absolutely. I mean, if it doesn't work out, then what are you going to do? But a lot of people seem to want to give up before even attempting, because it's way easier to say, well, all of this doesn't work, so I'm just going to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
And do you think it's a political question, or do you think it's sort of like some type of spiritual thing? Like, would you listen to me? Maybe you could say people would be like stereotypical Nietzscheans, and do you feel that there's like a? Is it like they're just thinking of the way to structure society and they're wrong, or is there like this dense, aggressive energy in them where they're like clearly unhappy and they want to see everybody crash down and everybody gunned against the wall or something like that? And the same with the Christians
I
or something like
disagree.
this?
I don't like this idea that a lot of more liberal people have of those who are fighting against liberalism. Oh, they're just all a bunch of loser incels and, half sex incel and all that. I don't see that at all. I see a lot of people who are generally interested in having some kind of a community, some kind of brotherhood where they would be able to lift each other up. And I think a lot of the people who subscribe to Bronze Age mindset and all that, they belong to that category of people. I talked to a lot of them, they're in shape. They want to see a much more high trust society. The thing, though, is that the way that they want to go about doing that, they end up putting all the power into the hands of one individual who's then going to be surrounded by a bunch of toadies that are only going to tell them what that person wants to hear. And at that point, whatever freedoms that we may be taking for granted right now is going to be sucked out. And that's why I don't look at a theocracy or a Nietzschean wonderland as being good ways of solving it, nor am I looking at what's going on right now as being great either. I mean, look at this train derailment that happened right now. I don't know who the investigators are. I don't know how well they were able to investigate it. And a lot of people are just standing by and saying, oh, well, I don't know. Like nobody seems to care. And that's the problem that people perceive in this kind of indifference of society today towards things that, if you really think about it, people should be making way, way, way more of an issue over. And when they think back to the robust presidents, like, for example, Teddy Roosevelt, who got almost assassinated, had a bullet in his chest, yet was still making a speech in front of a crowd, they think, oh, man, like, if only we had something like that. Thus, they would look at somebody like Vladimir Putin riding a horse and saying, okay, this is the closest guy that we currently have right now. So because he's against America, and America is all about all of this liberal nonsense and the transgenderism and the wokeness, we are going to be on the side of Putin now. The mistake that they are making is that the freedom that they have to voice their concern and their distaste against Biden, whether we're talking about not even just Fox News, but whether we're talking about, Alex Stein, for instance, who was on the show as well, being able to say whatever the hell he wants to say on Tucker Carlson or on his own show now on The Blaze, and much respect to him. But the point is that we have people who have the ability to voice their concern and to then transfer that concern into making certain policies in certain states, like Florida, for example, who's going in a different direction than other states when it comes to COVID, when it comes to other policies. So there is this freedom, which is not perfect by any means, and it should be much more free than it is right now, in my opinion. But we have that versus a situation in Russia where if you criticize what's going on with the war right now, you're not going to be able to have this nice protest with old Ron Paul there. You're going to be locked up and you're going to be sent to a detention camp. And then you're probably going to be, if you're a man, lined up in order to go into the meat grinder in Ukraine. And that's going to be the fate that awaits anybody who criticizes the Ubermensch in that future kind of society, which is why let's try and keep a lot of the good things that we have going for us here while trying to work on the bad things. The problem is that the liberals, they don't talk about the bad things. You talk about the bad things, and that's good. And I think more people should talk about the bad things.
Let me throw something in there real quick, because there's an Assyrian tablet from 2800 BCE, and it says, our earth is a degenerate in these days. Signs that the world is speedily coming to an end. Bribery and corruption are common. Children are no longer obeying their parents. The world is evidently So I just wanted to point that out, is that like the mindset of people thinking that we're in these degenerate days and the world, my generation, everyone was so good, and now the new generation sucks.
No, but
that's just like that's a natural feeling of like aging, I think.
No, but to Boyo's point, if history is a cycle, then that could have been the bad old days coming around, which then end up getting replaced by better times with strong men building up those better times. So I'm not, I'm kind of on Boyo's side there. That could be a possibility.
But also at the same time, we can literally pull up any year and find something similar to what I just said. So that cycle seems to always be in the same spot. always seems to be like people are. I'm just saying. I'm just giving you my.
It's true. It's even like, what was the one thing one thesis I'm presenting is that, if you wound back 2,000 years, Christianity would be this woke movement, and then Rome would be there, and it's the exact same thing as we're in now. And there'd be all these
kind of wild.
Republican pagans wearing like make the emperor great again or some shit like this. And you're like, what is going on? This is surreal. So we live in that eternal story. Mr. Neil, that brings us back. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts, because I said that story about Christianity starting off as like a very Jewish affair at the beginning, and maybe they were like maybe a little bit bitter towards Rome because they just nuked Judea basically. And the Platonism came into it afterwards, but you corrected me. You said, no, that's not correct. And it has a much different sort of etymology and growth. So maybe you could tell us a little bit of the philosophical history. And then I'd also love to hear a little bit more about maybe like the Dionysian ritual side of things, where like me and Lev right now, I'm seeing like 4 Levs at the moment, where all the early Christians getting blasted on.
I'm like Krishna. I'm like Krishna's heavenly form being shown to you right now.
You're telling me like, don't take the horseshoe, but there's fucking 2 of you. So I'm like, all right, wait a second. This is a psy-off. Like, what's happening here? Mr. Neil, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
The early Christians were very Dionysian in a lot of ways. I mean, you have different groups, such as, for example, the Nasenes. The Nas, it means serpent in Hebrew. Nasenes. They were the serpent people. Yeah.
By the way, is that why the rapper Lil Nas X is called Nas? Because he's like that whole serpent thing, the whole Satanism thing. Anyway, go on.
That might be true, actually. I don't know. But anyways, these Nasenes, they were living in Phrygia, which is modern day Turkey. They were Christians. They didn't call themselves Gnostics, which the later Christians called them Gnostics. The reason why they call them Gnostics is because they did believe in an idea of gnosis, which is, becoming so, basically it's becoming, you're so based that you become a god. That's what gnosis really is. You're just so fucking based. You're perfect. Like there's nothing wrong with you. You know everything. Like that's the idea. So there's the highest form of gnosis is apotheosis, where you literally attain godhood, and you are now given a temple, and there's a statue of you, and people are going to worship you because they want to imitate your ways. They want to become like you. That was the idea. That's like the pagan idea, is to the image that you're worshiping is something you want to sort of like replicate. But the Christians take these ideas on. The Pythagoreans, the Platonists, early on. The earliest Christians that we know about, like the Nasenes, for example, they were doing. The Nicene preacher was this guy. We don't know his real name. We only know him by the Nicene preacher because the church they didn't want to preserve any of his stuff for whatever reason. They just didn't want to. But he was so famous in his time. The only reason why we know about this is because Hippolytus, one of the church fathers, talks about it. So was Irenaeus, and I think Justin Martyr talked about it too. And they were saying that this guy was going around and saying. He was doing this syncretism thing, where he would say the Egyptians worshipped Osiris, the Phrygians worshipped Attis, the Greeks worshipped Dionysus, really all those were just versions of the Christ. So he was like saying he was applying all these different deities and saying what they really were trying to do. They were trying to find Christ. Here's the real deal. Christ. And then he was like, but he was doing this weird syncretism thing. Obviously that later becomes heretical. But you also have Sethians, and they were according to Hippolytus, they were doing initiation rites that were Bacchic in the form of like orgiastic, having like festivals and doing these like so
what were their name again? Sorry,
the Sethians. And Sethians. So the idea, you know how there's Christians today that do speaking in tongues. They're called the what are those Christians called? Not Episcopal. Whatever they're called.
Weren't you close to one of like a sect like that, or more?
Yeah, I was at the end of my Christianity. This is what I really was like. This is where the Spirit is. So I was doing my research, and I was finding out about these early Christians, and they were doing this. They were doing this thing where they let Christ would enter you. You would feel the Holy Spirit, and then he would take you over, and then you would just start speaking in tongues. Blah, 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 blah. That was the Spirit. But check this out. This is not a new thing that Christians are doing out in thin air. This is what the Bacchics were doing. The Bacchics were doing the same thing. And the Eleusinian mysteries, when you would get initiated, you would eat the bread, and then you would drink the wine. Eating the bread was eating the body of Demeter, and drinking
Yeah,
and drinking the wine was drinking the blood of Bacchus, and the two gods would enter you, and you would go into a state, and then after that initiation, after that they call it the Bacchic frenzy. After that frenzy, you no longer fear death, so they would just be like, oh, I'm saved. So a lot of these ideas that we see, and like some of the Pythagorean models, like there's a group called the Valentinians, and this guy named Marcus Magus, he wrote about how Jesus' name, Jesus Christ, in Greek has a gematria of 888, and so this is this idea of this ties to the logos thing, because in the Greek alphabet there's 26 letters. There's 24 letters back then. 24 letters, and 8 of them were, I think he said octagods, heptads, and decads. So there's 3 different types. 888. So he literally is the logos, because he's the word incarnate, and even his name says so. So they had this like math shit going on, and they thought that there was a monad. They were monists, like the Pythagoreans were monists. The monad is the beginning. The monad splits off into a duad. And from the duad, you get the Christ, who's the logos, and then you get Sophia, a goddess, who is also Zoe, and Zoe means life in Greek. So you have the mother, and then they had a different. They were the ones that came up with the Trinity, because they said that there was the Mother, the Father, and the Son, which later on it gets changed. They change it to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But you can see, like, if you actually look at all these different groups of Christians, you can see there's always one thing that they give that the church picks out of. So the church later on is looking at these groups, and they're taking
interesting.
It's like they're
pulling the best.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what happens with that. That's what you get. I mean, not all, because there's a group called the Cainites. These guys were just a bunch of I guess you could say they're a bunch of degenerates, because they were like they thought that Cain was the good guy, because they were Pythagoreans. Pythagoreans were vegetarians, and the vegetarianism was so important to them that they decided that Cain had to be good, because he was a tiller of the land, or Abel was a herdsman who offered up meat. And they were like, no, Cain is the good guy, so we're gonna call ourselves Cainites. So none of their shit got taken seriously.
So that's actually interesting.
One last thing, and I promise, because this is important. Their model is based off a dude named Marcion, who wasn't a Cainite. He didn't believe in the vegetarian stuff, but he did believe. And by the way, Marcion claimed to be a student of Paul himself. This is where, so we're getting early days. Marcion, which I don't even know if that's true, because Marcion, whatever, he claimed to be a student of Paul, but he might have been a student of Paul. That probably made more sense. But anyways, the point is, Marcion, he was the first person to put together a canon of books and call it a Bible. He took the letters of Paul and the book of John. That was it. It was just Paul and John, nothing else. Yeah. And so he said that the Old Testament God isn't the God of the universe. He's just one of the many daemons, one of the many angels and demons that are in the lower world. And he wasn't a good one. He was kind of dumb, actually. He said, I'll give you an example. Look at Genesis when he's looking for Adam in the garden. If he's all-knowing and all-powerful, he should know where Adam is. And he should know the future, and he would know that Adam would take a bite of the garden. He didn't know that. He can't be all-powerful. Then he also said, look at the part where Elijah gets called baldy by some kids, and he calls on Yahweh and sends a bunch of she-bears to kill and eat the kids. He said, no, the good God that I know about wouldn't do that. So Jesus had to have been the son of a different God. And that God is the what they call the demiurge, the perfect all being, the Plato's all good, basically. So Marcion was Platonist too. But yeah, I just wanted to throw that up. That's what they were coming from. Those are all Platonist ideas.
And so historically, and again, I'm going to start waxing historical analogies over this. So I'd love for you to try break them down and tell me where I'm incorrect. You have Alexander the Great conquer all of this area and establish the Hellenic world. And then obviously all of the Jews are then educated and they speak Greek to each other, hence why an awful lot of Christianity was even written down in Greek. Platonism is obviously going to be well installed inside of all of their minds as a consequence. What we see happen then is Christ show up. Obviously, after Jesus shows up, there's this explosion of all the different interpretations.
Yeah.
Does it look to you like it was something quite coherent? Like, would we look at it as the way that we have like Marxism, then we have Leninism, and then Stalinism? Is it very intellectually coherent, or is it something like we have these cultural habits and groups? So we have, would it be like nowadays if we looked at like a vegan, and then we'd maybe look at a pacifist, and then we'd maybe look at Satanists? They might be like the Cainites, for example. And these are all people with these moral habits, and I guess they have their different take. And eventually, you know, the establishment is going to pull together some type of way of seeing the world that takes a little bit, you know, you're going to eat the veganism and eat the bugs, and then you're going to do this and all this. And is that like the church constructing the Christian religion out of all this type of stuff?
You're going to eat
like,
the bread and drink the wine.
You're going to eat the bread and drink the wine, motherfucker.
That's a good question. It's kind of in the middle, because like what you have is you have Jesus coming, and he gets killed. And then you don't hear, there's no writings about Jesus, or Jesus doesn't write anything down, which, by the way, a lot of mythicists who think he doesn't exist, they point to that and say, that means he didn't exist. No. Pythagoras didn't write nothing down. Socrates didn't write. People not writing things down, it happened all the time. It's actually very common. It's actually more common than not that you wouldn't be a writer. Someone else would write something for you. You would go to a library, and a scribe would write down. And it was a very expensive process. So this wasn't just happening. It's not we have not like we have just journals laying around. So anyways, with that being said, Jesus comes, he lives, he dies. No one even knows who he is. And in fact, most of the history books around his life don't mention him, because it's like he's kind of just a guy who got in trouble and got killed. But my guess is, and a lot of people agree with me, but some people don't. My guess is he made some predictions that came true. For example, the temple falling. And the reason why I think that is because right after about 70 AD, all of a sudden people start writing about Jesus. You get Paul's letters. You get the Gospel of Mark.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
wow.
It's all happening right around the time the temple falls. You get a Christianity. So what I think happened is people are like, oh, there was this sage Jesus. We thought he was the Messiah when he was here, but then he died. And like, it was like, whatever, that's the end of that. But the temple really did fall. He was right. So I think after that happens, different groups start to sprout up. And these are people who are either Hypsisterians, probably, which are Greek monotheists living in Phrygia. Like,
so are these all Jews? Like, would these be Jews then who are with?
It's both. So right now,
like,
this is actually funny, because in Alexandria, Egypt, you have a huge Jewish population. So this is all a bunch of people who are ready to take in something like Christianity. But you also in Phrygia, which would be Turkey, you also have these people called Hypsisterians who are Greeks, and they're not Jews, but they're monotheists. They believe in Theos. That's it. There's just Theos, and they worship Theos. And so those are the people that Paul is writing to. Those are the church. Like nobody ever asked that question. Because Paul's letters come before the Gospels. You know that? Paul's letters are before Mark. Who's Paul writing to if Christianity is not a thing yet? He's writing to these Hypsisterians, these monotheistic proto-Christian types. You know what I mean?
Does Paul strike you as like this is very hard to project back in him, but does he seem like this savvy guy who's like really like, I'm going to throw together a movement now? Or is he a true believer who's trying to push this out? Like, what do you see there?
About Mark?
About Paul, sorry.
Oh, Paul, yeah. Paul is like, he's like a marketer or like a smart business person. He's trying to sell it, but I want to say manipulative, but he even admits it in his epistles. He'll say, I am one thing to Christians, I'm another to I'm one thing to Jews, I'm another to the Gentiles. He said, I'm all things to all people. That's a true salesman thing to say.
Yeah.
Like if you're selling cars, if a Marxist liberal comes in, you're not going to start talking. You're not going to throw on your red Trump hat, and you're going to act like them for a little bit because you want to sell that car. So that's how Paul is. Paul is a chameleon. He's going to different places and he's blending in. He even writes about and this is what he feels about pagans. In 1 Corinthians, he's like, you know what? You might go to a party, and they might sacrifice a meat to an idol, to a god. They might, and you might eat that meat. Who gives a shit? He's like, I don't care. You shouldn't either. And then he said, but then he pulls it back a little bit. Then he says, but if you're with a Christian who has a weak conscience, just don't eat the meat. They're not going to understand. Like he's like, you can see this is an elite mentality. He's a high thinker. I actually kind of like Paul in some ways, but there's other things he says that are kind of weird.
I got another question about Paul, though, before we go on. There was that story about the road to Damascus and about him seeing this bright light and all that. Do you think that Paul was somebody who would have made that story up, or do you think it would have been something that he would have actually had an experience with, be it a UFO or whatever? You know, I'm not going to get into that, but yeah.
I take a weird position on that. I think Paul saw something. I think something happened to Paul and he changed his life. That's what I think. Because otherwise, what is he doing? Why is he doing all that? I actually believe that Paul experienced something. So I don't know what form that was, but I would grant that, because things like that happen all the time. It's not like a random. It's not like it's like impossible.
There's
Go ahead.
So there's an accusation that you hear from the Nietzschean perspective that Paul, like, obviously he was Jewish, he was from Judea, and Rome had literally just annihilated his home. You know, the most horrific thing possible, like to wipe your country off the face of the earth. That's fucking something else.
Yeah.
Now, do you like you know, it's very hard to read people's intentions, but do you think it's possible that Paul might have been motivated by some type of vengeance, and he was like, I want to go in here and I want to change how these people think, and I want to you know, get this new religion in and get rid of the Greek gods? Like, is there this aggression towards paganism and Romanness, or is that all?
No,
I
think there's some truth to that. I think Paul not only did he want, but I think he thought that Rome would fall, and I think that he believed in the message of because the Jewish Messiah before Jesus was supposed to come and usher in the kingdom of heaven and make all the nations bow to Jerusalem. That didn't happen with Jesus, so they ended up having to. So the Christians ended up going with, well, there's also a suffering Messiah. And some people thought there'd be two Messiahs. Right now, the Christians think there's a second coming. But early on, there was two Messiahs. One of them is called the triumphant Messiah. The triumphant Messiah is the one who comes and leads the armies into Rome and destroys Rome. That's the triumphant Messiah. The suffering Messiah is the one who comes in and dies for everybody. That was Jesus. But now Christians just rolled it into one and just say he's just going to come back. It's a second coming. But yeah, so back to Paul, though. I do think that Paul thought that Rome was going to fall because he believed. He's a believer. He's not like an atheist. He believes this is going to work. He thinks in it. He believes in this stuff, you know. So I think he thought that he was doing God's work by going into the Gentile world and teaching the Messiah came. He's already here. Like that was.
And do you detect like a strong animus towards Rome, or like an aggression, or is it more just like he's like literally like, I actually believe that this is the end, this is a new era we're moving into now. It's maybe not actually aggressive. I'm trying to ask psychologically, is he motivated by resentment or not? He might not be.
He ends up getting arrested and he ends up writing letters in jail in Turkey. He's in a Roman jail in Turkey, surrounded by what are they called? The Rome? They're not soldiers. They're called something else. But
legionnaires.
No, it's something. It starts with a P.
Praetorians.
Praetorians.
Yeah.
He's surrounded by these Praetorians, and he's like, "I'll convert these guys." He's like, "I'm going to start talking to these Praetorians." And so he's writing about talking to Praetorians, and he's like, "Some of these people are," and he says it in the letter. I forgot which one. I think it's which letter is it? A letter to the Ephesians, actually. And he's like, yeah, some of these people are going to get saved, and this is going to be this is going to change everything. Like, he's optimistic about this thing.
Wow.
So yeah, and here's another thing. Christianity is very Romanized in that sense, because it is drawing from concepts in Greek religion in a lot of ways, like we talked about with the Eleusinian mysteries thing, the Bacchic frenzy thing. So it's not a surprise to me that Christianity ends up taken over the world of religion. By the time we get to Constantine, there's basically two religions left, and that's the sun god religion that started with Elagabalus. Elagabalus brings in, and they're both Eastern, they're both Semitic religions. All the Western traditional Zeus and Athena religions, they're gone. But nobody cares. That's all old. They want to know. They want these, because what happens, and this is Kyle Ruck taught me this. Kyle Ruck, you know who Kyle Ruck is? He's he wrote the book about how the Eleusinian mysteries were taking psychedelics. He also was on Jordan Peterson's channel. He was on my channel twice.
He taught that the Eleusinian mysteries were what? Sorry,
they were taking psychedelics.
Interesting. And does he have any thoughts that like Christianity came in and started to present itself as the new version, the update of Dionysus in those?
Mm.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, that's what he said. He said that
Wow.
he basically thinks that Jesus was like a Jewish Bacchus, basically. That's what he thinks.
So
But he
so
said that-
Christianity was pro psychedelics as well.
Well, I don't know if he's no, I don't think he said that. There's other people who think that. I don't think Ruck says that, but Ruck thinks that why Christianity was so Christianity and the sun god religion, which became Sol Invictus, they were seen as exotic. Like, do you know how people in
Yeah.
America or they're always like, oh, I want to be a Hindu or Buddhist because
Yeah.
that's how Romans were. They're like, Christianity, what's that? It sounds
Yeah.
exotic. Or
Well, first they were into
Oh.
Judaism, right? First, Judaism was a thing that was appealing to some of the Romans.
yeah, oh yeah, there was because Judaism was legalized by Augustus, so it was
Oh wow, yeah.
even though people didn't like it and they were like very anti-Semitic, even back then, Augustus was like, well, they're in our empire, so he legalized it, and then he made this he made a law that said as long as the Christians, I'm not asking you to worship me because everyone else had to worship him. You got to worship me if you want to be in this. But he made a little side note for the Jews. All right, I know you're not going to worship me. I know you guys had this thing. He's like, but as long as you offer a sacrifice and pray for me, then you can keep your thing. And they were like, deal. So they were doing this. And up until the time of Caligula. And Philo writes about this. This is the reason why we know this story. This is a crazy story. Philo says that Caligula was a madman. And he was, everyone knows this. He has this giant mansion boat that he's throwing parties on.
Made the horse a senator.
Yeah, he made a horse a senator. He's nuts. He goes into Judea, and he says, "Why aren't you worshiping me?" And they're like, "But Caesar, we made the deal with Augustus that we're gonna we literally just slayed a bull for you. Was it to me? Well, no, it's to Yahweh, but it's for you. It's for your success." And he's like, it's not enough. So
I like how you sound like Larry David, by the way, when you said that. But anyway, go on.
This is what happened. And so it got ugly. It got really ugly to the point where he started threatening to kill everybody. It was going to be a genocide, but somehow they got out of it. I forgot what Philo said. Something happened where they ended up like getting out of it. And Philo was like, I thought that was the end of my life. He's like, I was shaking. He was like, my heart was beating. I thought I was going to get killed right then and there. But somehow he got out of it. But anyways, just to show you what was going on, Christianity and Elagabalus started this new religion that came out of Syria. And the reason why this religion was so popular is because Elagabalus was a grandson of Julia Domna. Julia Domna was a descendant of Mark Antony and not only Mark Antony, but also Cleopatra. Mm-hmm. And so they had a sacred priesthood in Syria that was set up there since those days, since before them, actually. Mm-hmm. And she was chosen to marry Emperor Septimus Severus. So when she married him, her priesthood and her grandson Elagabalus, who takes over, becomes emperor, they changed everything. The Roman, but you know what it says in the Historia Augusta? They not only brought in those rites into the Roman imperial cult, they also legalized Christianity and the Samaritan religion. So now people are being exposed to all these Eastern religions. They got the ball rolling. So by the time they get to Constantine, that's it. There's only two religions that are popular. It's Christianity and Sol Invictus.
And what about the Mithras one that they were doing in the army? That was the Persian.
That was the Sol Invictus one. So Sol Invictus was actually a syncretist religion where Mithra and Helios were sort of rolled into one god. It was Mithra, Helios, and Zeus rolled into one god.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So sort of like what was
super god, like Jupiter is already the greatest of the gods, but they combined him with the sun Helios and Mithras, and now it's like boom. Now there's nothing even better than that.
It's like sort of like a trinity in a weird way, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, that's the reason Platonism is the reason why we have Trinity, because the Platonists, like the Neoplatonists, they believed in called triadic. It was called triads, where they would take three gods and they would roll them into one, and they would like play with that a little bit. They were like playing Legos with gods.
And so you have the people on one hand, I guess you could say around the Mediterranean basin, they are looking at Christ, and they're synchronizing him with Platonism, and they're synchronizing him with various gods around them as well. And then up in the high empire of the Roman Empire, they're doing something actually somewhat similar. They're blending the gods together and doing it maybe from a different direction. And so the competing religions was these two forces, and very, very interesting. And do you see when Christianity began to move into Rome? Okay, actually, here's a better question. So what was going on then with Julian the Apostate? Like, was he trying to bring people back to this more Mithras, Sol Invictus religion, or was he trying to go back to like strict secular Hellenism in some sense? Because I know he wasn't trying to go back to Zeus and the boys. It was actually like Platonism as well. A lot of people.
Yeah, it was it was like he was going like he saw Helios as the highest good. So yeah, it was this. It was the Sol Invictus. It was, but here's the thing about the Sol Invictus religion. The Sol Invictus religion was not like Christianity, where you had to have all your devotion to one god. The Sol Invictus religion was like, okay, the Egyptians have a priesthood dedicated to Serapis. He's their daemon. He's their mediator between the Sol Invictus and humans. The Jerusalem temple, Yahweh, he's their mediator. Athena in Athens, she's the mediator. Every city had a local god, what they called the daemon. And so it was very polytheistic in that sense, but the ultimate god was the Sol Invictus god. So Julian,
and that was sort of blended with Jupiter.
Julian the Apostate, guess he's the only person up until 1948 when the Jews went back to Israel, right? 1948. Guess who was the last person to want to move the Jews back to Israel out of all people was Julian the Apostate, a pagan, because he hated Christianity so much. He wanted to take Christianity, or take Jerusalem away from Christianity, bring it back to the Jews, because he wanted there to be the Jewish God in Jerusalem. And he wrote a letter to the Alexandrians saying, "Why are you all Christians? You guys used to have Serapis. Serapis and Isis. They're amazing gods. What's wrong with them?" Like, he was trying to plead for those gods.
Wait, hold on. Let's go back a second here. Here's what I'm confused about. You were saying that Yahweh was a mediator god, but that goes totally against the whole idea of the Hebrew religion being one where their god is the ultimate.
We're outside of Judaism now. This is how he would see it.
So other people saw the Jewish God as being different from what the Jews saw him as.
He doesn't care what the Jews think about their God. He's saying they don't know nothing. They're just worshiping a mediator. But this is like the early Christians, like Marcion, who was like, no, that Yahweh's not that great. He's just a dumbass. He didn't even know where Adam was. That's the same idea. It's not that Yahweh doesn't exist. Yeah. It's that he's just a lesser God. So you see that with Julian the Apostate. But here's another thing, because people always wonder this. When Rome fell in 479, wait a minute, why didn't the church fall too? Well, turns out the barbarians were Christians, because the Arians were going into Germany and Gaul and teaching and spreading Arianism, and so they were all Arians. So when Rome fell, Christianity just replaced Christianity. It's just Christianity still. Christianity never skipped a beat in Rome when Rome fell. But not only that, the Senate stayed too. The Senate convened on the next day after Rome fell. So people think like Rome fell and everything was barbarian pagans. No, it was civilized Christians and people the reason why they're called barbarians, because they didn't speak Latin. They're just speaking German shit. So that's what they call barbarians. But yeah, they were Christians that invaded Rome.
Neil, do you think that there was something in Christianity that made it a lot harder for there to be a lot of advancement, a la the Roman Republic, when it comes to aqueducts, various technologies? Because it seems to me like when you have this emphasis on our guy is the only god that ever existed and all these other ones are just like pagan nonsense, it's a very different approach than the Sol Invictus one that you mentioned, which, at least to me, looking at it from the outside in, looks like it would allow for a lot more flexibility in how people conduct their lives, for better or worse. I don't know. Like, what do you think? Do you think that if Sol Invictus would have been the path forward instead of Christianity, we would have had better technology and more progress, however you would define that, earlier than we actually did?
And there's another misconception that if it wasn't, like, a lot of Christians will say that the other pagan religions were all just a bunch of degenerates that were, into human sacrifice and orgies and
Moloch, no problems. Yeah.
But the teachings of Pythagoras are central. The teachings of the pre-Socratics, Plato, all these minds. Like instead of having Jeremiah and Isaiah, you're looking at Plato and Pythagoras and all those guys. So they had this idea of piety and doing good and having morals and having principles. That was always part of the deal. So it's not like Christianity brought that in, but yeah, so I think with the Sola Invictus religion, I think it's less. So I think Nietzsche would have had a lot different critiques on this religion, because it actually has more. There's actually less of a emphasis on letting the poor get salvation. It's more about this idea of like doing good and having principles, gaining knowledge. Let the better rise up. You know what I mean? So I don't know what he would think about it, but I think he'd like it more than Christianity.
Yeah, he talks about this quite a lot even in Genealogy of Morals, where it's so interesting to look at our modern world and we see how much we value pity, compassion. We'd understand it now, maybe even empathy, but I don't think that's more of a technical term than the moral. But that's just not present in the ancient world in any way. It's way more contextualized. Like it's pity is obviously a virtue, but it's hierarchical. So there's like much higher. Bravery is a much higher virtue than pity, for example.
Right.
And when he would talk about the Romans and the Greeks, yes, he would absolutely point to exactly what you're saying. Like they had their own system of. He points this out when he talks about the thing you read from the Antichrist, whereas they had a vision of God that permitted them to be bombastic, creative, brave. And it had, Jupiter back then was an empowering image of strength and vitality and success and virtue. And they followed all these, they were very moral people. The word moral comes from the Roman word mente or the more or something like this, which means the kind of way of the ancestors. And so there was morality before Christianity. Absolutely. There was like people thinking about this stuff very, very deeply before it. You're actually describing it in such a way that I think I'm trying to model this in my head, because what it seems like is that Platonism had so saturated all of the Hellenic world,
everything,
that basically when Christianity starts running around, it's like Christianity's just it's a big claim, but it doesn't seem like Christianity really is adding anything into that theological side of things. It's making things supernatural, but it's not really adding anything in terms of like a sophisticated moral system. It sounds like it was all already there. It sounds like the philosophical first principles were all just completely put together.
Yeah. Just to be a devil's advocate, though, if we're not talking about the high-minded philosophy, but just talking about things like help the poor and the weak shall inherit the earth, that's not really from the New Testament. You know what I'm talking about, right? Like it's easier for the whole camel through the eye of a needle type of thing, like that. Those seem to be very Christian. Yeah.
So I know some scholars who put together what they call Q. It's a reconstruction of things that probably weren't made up, that probably were actually said by Jesus. You should check it out. It's called the Q. I'm actually going into
trust the plan.
And actually, the guy
it's called Q.
The guy teaches at Toronto University, and I'm going there to this.
I've got message lever. I got to sign off and press the button.
All right. We're gonna be done soon, but yeah, go on, Neil. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, so there's this thing called Q that John Kloppenborg from Toronto University put together, and it's the things that Jesus probably said that probably weren't made up. But so the idea of the one that gets attributed to Jesus the most is the golden rule: love your neighbor like you love yourself. But it turns out that was not only said by Hillel the Elder 60 years before Jesus in Israel, but you also have that coming from the Buddha as well. So that idea was already floating around. He probably said it in his own way. But as far as like things that Jesus probably said, he probably did some, like he probably cursed. He probably said that some of the stuff about like a lot of the stuff about Israel, about the Pharisees, about the Sabbath. Like if you're like, this is the thing that's something Jesus probably said. If your animal falls into a Sabbath, aren't you going to get it? Like, why would you just make that up about somebody? That sounds like it's such a specific thing. It's very localized. First of all, we're talking about people that he's living with. It's not like some grand Roman national. Like, this is something that's very specific to him. So there's a lot of stuff like that, but there is some pretty deep philosophical ones too. I forgot.
Wait, animal falls into the Sabbath? What do you mean?
Jesus is living in a time of Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. they're all different, 3 different groups that have different views on certain things. Some of the more radical ones said on the Sabbath, the 10 Commandments says keep the Sabbath holy. So you can't work on the Sabbath, which means if you're animal, working means like tending to your animals, planting stuff. If your animal falls into a ditch and it's crying, it's screaming, you have to let it scream all day till sundown and listen. And you can't let it, it's like freaking out, and you have to let it there because that's what the Sabbath says. You cannot work. Pulling your animal out of the Sabbath would be called work, and that you go to hell for that. Jesus came along and said, bro, if your animal falls into the Sabbath, just fucking pick it up, bro. Who gives a shit? But he had a very stoic mind, very stoic, very cynic mind too. He's very cynical. Actually, John Kloppenborg, the guy I was talking about, he thinks Jesus was a cynic. He thinks that there was a group of cynics that were Jewish, and Jesus was part of that group.
Wow,
just a quick aside, by the way, it reminds me of this story about how in the Talmud they talk about if a Gentile was to take a piece of ham, like a piece of pork, and drop it into the soup that for some reason would be made outdoors, like a soup for the entire Jewish village, then the way that you know whether or not to eat the soup or not is you have to measure the amount of liquid of the soup relative to the amount of ham that was put in there. And if it does not go beyond a certain amount, then the ham is kosher. You could eat the ham. So now I'm imagining there would be certain saboteurs, certain people who would intentionally make a deal with the Jews there, who would go and launch like a piece of ham into that whole outdoor soup thing, intentionally exactly the size to make that ham be kosher, so that way Jews can eat free ham. But anyway, that's just that's an aside. And with that, fellas, I think this is the end of the stream. Uberboyo, any final thoughts?
No, it's good. I just like Neil's such a comprehensive knowledge of all this. It's very, very interesting to dig into it and come to see it, because I'm constructing narratives, and it's always good to just get checked at the door to make sure I don't like start spinning all crazy
Check your privilege.
True, so.
Your point was still valid in the sense that when Rome decides we're gonna take Christianity and we're gonna control it, they are doing that. Like it's not like they're doing what the early Christians were doing. Like they did, in a sense, Apollonize it.
Yeah. Well, I guess so that's one side of it, which is very interesting in and of itself, and it's so fascinating to look at like what Julian the Apostate actually believed, and the fact that he was not a pagan atheist. He was a highly pious man, and
right?
He was pulling off a religion that Christianity might have grafted itself onto, that was already there, and in some sense Christianity might have actually been a continuation of that religion more than anything in and of itself. Obviously a synchronization of things. Yeah. Now I'm also wondering about the other side. Like this is an awful lot more of an accusation, and it's implying psychological motive. Like was Christianity, how much does that relate to the fact that Judea got destroyed? Like Judea gets annihilated, and are the Christians swirling, and is St. Paul like angry, and he's sort of like, I want to see Rome fall? It's sort of, how could we describe it? Maybe if you look at the world we live in now, could you say that the woke people, do they maybe have an aggression towards the old Western world, and they want to see it fall? And was there that type of energy in Christianity, and did it have that type of movement? These are all interesting questions. And then the thing you brought up about Jesus and his ethos, this was Lev's point, that Jesus did have certain parts of his ethos that were unique and novel. And Nietzsche would accuse those of being part of the slave morality side of it. But that's actually very, very true as well. And so, like, how did they factor in? And how was it just that stuff too? So these are a load of very interesting collages to pull together.
Yeah, real quick, because I know Lev has to go. But, so they actually thought of the Jews as the ones who are rejecting Jesus at that point. So they're now not only anti-Rome, but they're also anti-temple going priestly class. But what they're saying, if we read the book of Hebrews, it's very clear. The temple is no more. Jesus is the temple now. So now we don't need the temple anymore. We don't need Jerusalem anymore.
And how early was this? Like, so I'm trying to think of this from my psychology.
That is probably after the temple fell, when they start saying.
That's very interesting, because then obviously the Judea gets annihilated, and you're saying to me that Christianity really kicks into gear after that, because everyone's like, fuck, that Jesus dude is right.
Because the Jesus dude is right, and the priesthood class was wrong. Because why would God smite the priesthood class? He has to. That's what happens. You can see it. You can sort of see how.
Yeah. That's what I'm trying to perceive into, because that's what's so fascinating is actually get your head in there. And so do the Christians turn around and be like, hey, fuck those priests.
Yeah.
We're going to build a temple again. You got us, lost us the temple. And the temple now becomes an abstraction. The temple is now in Christ.
Exactly.
And this is actually preparing the Jews to wander. And so they become a nationless people who wander and they follow the temple around and they sort of blend and integrate. That's so interesting.
That's such a good observation right there. That's what it is. They're now in the desert now. They're now wandering.
And at that time, there were like only 600 Jews alive at a certain point, right, Neil? Like it was.
I don't think it was.
No, it was no. That's what I read. I'll show you the statistic afterwards. Yeah, there were like a very small amount.
Bar Kokhba happens in the 120s. Yeah, 120s under Hadrian wipes them out. Hadrian goes nuts, dude. He almost wipes them out. Bar Kokhba, millions of Jews were killed. People don't talk about that. People talk about 70 AD. 70 AD was nothing compared to 120. Look up when Bar Kokhba happened. What year? Bar Kokhba.
Bar Kokhba. It's giving me a cocktail bar. I probably put that in wrong.
Don't go there, lad.
Bar Kokhba revolt was 132. I'm sorry, 132. So yeah, 132. They got wrecked. It said, this is what it says for Wikipedia. It says 400,000 Jews were killed. I said millions, but yeah, 400,000. That's crazy. Crazy. Compared to 20,000 Romans. 400,000 to 20,000. Damn.
Wow.
Dude.
And so they went in. And how?
No. 580,000 Jews were killed. 50 fortified towns, 985 villages razed. This is way crazier than 70 AD.
And how does this work then? So are these all just the leftover villages in Judea? They obviously so what must have happened in 70 is it was like
World War II compared to World War I, where Germany sat and marinated for a while. That's what the Jews basically did. They sat there, they marinated. And they're like, let's get them back, and they got fucked over. It was bad. And if you are right about that 400 number, which that's
600.
Low. So if that's true, then it's probably after that.
Yeah, and then there was the integration, the intermingling with the Eastern Europeans. I think that was around the time, or maybe it was first the Italian women, because there was a lot of Jewish men and Italian women, or Mediterranean women rather, who ended up having children. So I got to check when the 600 number comes in, either before that. That was actually.
Yeah. I was gonna say. So
that was a really small number. I think there was only they traced it 40.
Woo! Oh man, yeah. And
yes, the Jews are always getting whipped on. You have Nebuchadnezzar. You have Antiochus in the 200s BCE. You have Pompey the Great sacks them in 63 BCE. Then Gaius Sosius gets sent in by Augustus to go shake things up. That happens. That's the fourth time. Then it happens again in 70. Then it happens again in 132.
And it's so ironic that all of those people, like the Nebuchadnezzars of the world, like the Babylonians, the Romans, the ancient Greeks, where are they now? It's very ironic how no matter who goes against a very small minority of people, they don't it doesn't seem to work.
Israel exists right now and Babylon doesn't. That's kind of interesting. Neither does Rome.
Yeah. By the way, one last thing. Sorry to report, very bad news, and Philip Daniel confirmed this. They were not allowed to eat the pork. So the 160th rule, it was called. It says, so if one nice piece of non-kosher meat is added into a cholent, and the cholent, that's a traditional Hungarian Jewish stew made with kidney beans, barley, onions, paprika, and usually meat, with other small pieces of kosher meat, and there is a 1/60th ratio of non-kosher meat to kosher meat, the pot is still considered kosher, and potatoes and beans are allowed to be consumed, but none of the meat may be consumed. So I'm sorry to say, fellas, it's over. Okay, anyway, guys,
you get the juice.
Yeah.
Jesus. Yeah.
Jesus.
The first revolt is crazy. I'm just looking at it here. Josephus claimed 1 million people were killed during the siege of Jerusalem. It's what?
Oh, so that's even more then. Oh, maybe it was worse.
Now wait a second. The second one that you were tallying might have been actual military combats, and then the actual civilians on top.
Yeah. Because the second one was more. The second one.
It looks like it was absolutely crazy at that point. Yeah,
the second one was 50 towns. So you had Jerusalem getting sacked, which that's They're both nuts. It's like that was just a crazy time. If you're the last thing I'm going to say, I promise. This is nuts though. Josephus, you mentioned Josephus. Josephus tells a story about the summer of 70 in Jerusalem. There was a woman who was in her house, and the Roman legions went to go, and they smelled something cooking, and it was a drought. There's no food. Everyone's dying of starvation. They're all skinny to the bone because the whole town is surrounded by Titus Caesar. They can't get out. They can't get imports. They can't have exports. They're all stuck in the city for like a whole entire 6 months. They're all starving to death. There's a woman in her house, and there's something smoking coming out of it, and they're like, "Oh, it's food. Let's go get it. Let's go steal it from her." So the robbers ran in there, and they take out. They look to see what she's cooking. It's her fucking baby. She was gonna eat her baby.
Damn.
This is so crazy to read about because Neil, as we're trying to try put our heads in their perspective, the Bar Kokhba revolt. There was this guy called Simon Bar Kokhba, and he was super charismatic, and he presented himself as the Messiah.
Yep.
And the Bar Kokhba revolt greatly influenced the course of Jewish history, of course, because this is when they eradicated Judea and turned it into Palestine. And it indicated the philosophy of the Jewish religion. Despite easing the persecutions of the Jews following Hadrian's death in 138, the Romans barred Jews from Jerusalem except for attendance of certain festivals. The Messiah energy, though, started to become abstracted and spiritualized, which is what we were talking about with Christianity. So that was already happening since 70 AD because of the pressure. And even the rabbis, they were becoming deeply cautious and conservative. So they didn't want to stoke the fire with Rome. So the Talmud refers to Bar Kokhba as Ben Kushiba, a derogatory term meaning a deceiver, because he was a false messiah and he was trying to rile everyone up. He was sort of like, QAnon back in the day, trying to rile everyone up and get them to fight against the Romans. And everyone seems like to think that was a bad idea. And of course, once they stoked the Romans, it seems like that was the Romans just went down just brutally hard as a consequence. So that's
wait, one more quick question to Neil. Wasn't Titus considered to be the Messiah by some of the Jews who were against all this?
Not the Jews,
yeah,
but there was Tacitus actually wrote this in his histories that there's a Jewish Messiah, that a star will come out of the east and be the king of the world. So when Titus and his dad Vespasian, it's not about Titus, it's about his dad Vespasian, by the way. When they were in Jerusalem, while they were there conquering, that's when the year of the 4 emperors went down. That's in 69. Remember that. Nero dies. Then it goes from Galba, he's only there for 2 months. Otho, 2 months. And then Vitellius, that fat decadent emperor, he's there for like a month. Then all 4 of them die, and so Vespasian gets hailed as Caesar while he's in the east. So Tacitus says the star will come out of the east. He came out of the east and then went to Rome. So they were like, the Jewish Messiah is Vespasian. So there are people who actually did think that was a rumor going around.
Among the Jews as well, like wasn't there some high up Jewish priest or something?
Yeah, the Talmud has a story about this. So
see, there we go.
Yohanan ben Zakkai, who is I think he's the high priest actually, and he's stuck in Jerusalem the same year I was telling you about where the girl ate her baby. He's stuck in Jerusalem, and he knows that Titus is outside, and he knows he can make a deal and save his life and save some other people's lives if he just go out there and strike a deal. So he pretends to die because they're only taking bodies out. They're not taking anything else out except for dead bodies. So he pretends to be a dead body. He sneaks out in the middle of the night, and then he runs up on Vespasian and says, "It's me, Yohanan ben Zakkai." He's like, "You are the king. You are the king, as it is prophesied in Isaiah." And then he starts spitting out Bible verses on him. And Vespasian's like, chill. All right, whatever, bro. I guess I'm the Messiah. Who gives a fuck? Like, he's like, yeah, I don't give a shit about that. And he's like, what do you want? And he's like, I'll make a deal. Just don't kill me and save this city. It's called Yavne, which ends up being the home of rabbinic Judaism, where rabbinic Judaism, today's Judaism is all because of this deal right here. So he's like, save the city of Yavne. I'm going there now. Just here, I'll give you the map for the whole city. You can do what you want with it. This will help you out in the war. Boom, boom, boom. He makes a deal. He gets his life saved. That's that. So he did. So now he's not calling him the Messiah, but he's calling him the king that was promised. And the verses that he uses are actually verses that are used for Christianity, for the Messiah. So in a weird, indirect way, he does call him the Messiah.
But was it implied that he was just LARPing, that he was just making it up in order to save the village, or was he actually?
Oh yeah, that's 100% what was going on. Why
Oh,
wouldn't?
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That is very interesting how the entire fate hung in the balance just from this one action of this one dude who pretended to be a dead body. That's
Yeah,
so
it's wild,
crazy.
man. What a weird. They make movies about Caesar and Alexander. They need to make a movie about like Israel in the '60s when Nero is go from Nero to Vespasian. Like make
Yeah.
a whole movie.
The
or
sword.
HBO series about it.
Yeah, there's
Man,
not
just-
enough in the sword and sandal genre, so we definitely gotta do it. I haven't
Yeah.
seen Ben-Hur yet, by the way. I definitely want to see Ben-Hur soon. So anyway, guys, this is the end of the stream. Plug
All right.
your plug your stuff, everybody. Uberboyo, what do you got to plug?
Gentlemen, I just say if there's any boyos following, give Lev a follow and check out Neil. He's like a really good scholar of early Christianity, a lot of very interesting perspectives. And of course, Classical Theist as well. Give him a look. It seems like he is a good Catholic. You know, got to support the Catholics around here. So thank you very much, gentlemen. And stay juicy. And obviously, Uberboyo over there on YouTube. So I hope all is well.
Excellent. And Neil, what do you got coming up, my friend?
Yeah, I just released a video about the orgiastic rites of the mysteries, and I did a piece. I quoted Clement of Alexandria and his perspective on it, so you have that part of the video too. And yeah, so that's my last video. YouTube.com/Gnostic Informant, and that's where it is.
Nice. And you could follow me at LevPo, LEVPO on YouTube. And this has been streaming on YouTube, on Twitch, if you can believe that, on Odyssey. This is going to be available on Odyssey after this. Same with BitChute and all the other things. Be sure to smash that subscribe button, smash that like button, smash the bell, share this with all your friends. And that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Always appreciated. Always much love. Next
Cheers,
week,
gents.
Ariel Pink and Gnostic Informant. You're back with Ariel Pink talking about the book of fucking Revelation. We're going to go
Can't
for
wait.
it.
I
It's going to
can't
be
wait.
live.